Greetings, quiet contemplators of historical nightmares. Tonight we journey down the legendary Silk Road. But forget the exotic silks and glittering treasures. The reality was a sun-scorched, bandit-infested highway to bankruptcy and an early grave. It was less a grand adventure and more a prolonged, dusty, financially ruinous death wish. If this chronicle of ancient misery is your twisted lullaby, you absolutely must subscribe and like this video now. Don't let this historical suffering go unappreciated. Comment your location and time below. Let's see our global caravan. Now, dim the lights and prepare for the regret. The very name, the Silk Road, conjures images of romance and adventure. We picture a golden thread stretching across the ancient world, a vibrant artery of commerce and culture. In our minds, caravans loaded with shimmering silks, fragrant spices, and precious gems traverse majestic landscapes connecting the grand empires of Han China with the mighty Romans. It was the world's first great superhighway, a conduit for ideas, art, religion, and philosophy. It promised not just wealth but a worldly wisdom, a chance to see wonders beyond the horizon. This is the story we're sold in documentaries and textbooks. A noble enterprise of brave pioneers linking humanity. It's a beautiful, inspiring lie. The reality, for the poor soul actually walking the path, was a nightmare. The Silk Road wasn't a single paved highway. It was a sprawling, chaotic web of treacherous, unmarked trails, and for the merchant, it was the definition of a high-risk, low-reward career. The sales pitch promised riches beyond imagination. The reality delivered dysentery, bandits, and a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. It was the ultimate ancient bait-and-switch. You were lured in by tales of mountains of gold and left with mountains of debt, assuming you weren't simply left as a desiccated corpse in the middle of a desert, your life's ambition reduced to a cautionary tale for crows. Before a merchant even took his first step, he was likely drowning in financial anxiety. The upfront investment was colossal. You had to purchase your trade goods and not just a few trinkets. You needed enough to make the entire multi-year journey worthwhile. Then came the transport, a string of sturdy yet breathtakingly expensive Bactrian camels. You needed to hire guards, guides, and translators. You paid fees, tariffs, and outright bribes just to get out of the city gates. Most merchants were backed by investors, who expected a hefty return, meaning you started your journey deep in debt, gambling your future on not dying for the next 2 years. Your first major test was the environment itself, a relentless enemy, the infamous Taklamakan Desert, whose name chillingly translates to "the place of no return," was a formidable barrier. By day, the sun was a merciless hammer, threatening heat stroke and dehydration. By night, temperatures plummeted to freezing. And then there were the sandstorms, the black hurricanes, which could appear without warning, burying entire caravans and wiping all traces of the path from existence. The thirst was a constant, maddening companion, and a single cracked waterskin could doom you and your entire party to a slow, agonizing end under a white-hot sky. If you somehow survived the scorched earth of the desert, your reward was to face the heavens in the worst possible way, the mountains. The Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, were a vertical hell of razor-sharp peaks and terrifyingly narrow ledges. Here, the air was so thin it felt like breathing through a straw, leading to debilitating altitude sickness. A single misstep by a man or a camel could send your entire fortune, and yourself, plummeting into an icy abyss. Landslides and avalanches were a constant threat, capable of obliterating a path that had existed for centuries, leaving you stranded in a frozen, unforgiving wilderness. The breathtaking views were wasted on men who were just trying not to die. And what of your fellow man? He was often the greatest danger of all. The vast, ungoverned stretches of the Silk Road were a paradise for bandits, nomads, and local warlords who viewed merchants as mobile treasure chests. These weren't charming rogues, they were ruthless killers who would slaughter a whole caravan for a few bolts of silk. A merchant's best-case scenario during an attack was to be robbed of everything and left to starve. The worst case involved torture, being sold into slavery, or a quick, anonymous death. The guards you hired? They were often just one missed paycheck away from becoming the very bandits you hired them to fight. Even if you evaded bankruptcy, deserts, mountains, and bandits, the daily grind was a special kind of misery designed to crush your spirit. For months, even years on end, your world was the back of a camel and a monotonous, unchanging landscape. Your diet consisted of stale bread, dried meat, and foul, brackish water that was a breeding ground for disease. Sicknesses like cholera and dysentery were rampant and often fatal. Scorpions would greet you in your bedroll, and fleas would be your most constant companions. It was a journey of profound boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. So after all this suffering, was the payoff worth it? For the vast majority, the answer was a resounding no. After paying off investors, guides, guards, and the endless tolls demanded by every petty king along the way, the profit margins were razor-thin, if they existed at all. The real wealth of the Silk Road was consolated by the elite few, the kings, the nobles, and the master financiers sitting comfortably in their palaces. The merchant was just a disposable mule. Their misery, however, makes for a fascinatingly bleak story. If you appreciate these delightful descents into historical despair, then you have a duty to subscribe and hit the like button. It's the only way we can keep unearthing these tales of woe. Your click is the modern-day profit margin that makes all this ancient suffering worthwhile for us. Welcome back, my connoisseurs of catastrophe. In our last chapter, we established that the life of a Silk Road merchant was, to put it mildly, a terrible career choice. But before a merchant even had the privilege of being robbed by bandits or cheated by a business partner, he first had to contend with a far more formidable and relentless adversary, the Earth itself. The terrain of the Silk Road wasn't just a backdrop for the journey. It was an active, malevolent participant in it. It was a character in this story, and its sole motivation was to kill, maim, or at the very least make every single waking moment an exercise in profound misery. The journey was a masterclass in choosing your preferred method of suffering. There was no single, pleasant, scenic route. Instead, the network of trails offered a hellish buffet of options. Would you like to be baked alive and buried in sand? We have a desert for that. Do you prefer freezing to death, falling from a cliff and struggling for every breath? The mountain pass awaits. Or perhaps you'd enjoy a descent into madness in a vast, featureless plain where the horizon never changes. Step right this way to the steps. The merchant's initial choice of path was less about strategy and more about which particular brand of natural torment he felt most prepared to endure. Let us begin where most journeys from the east did, in the soul-crushing embrace of the desert. Two titans of desolation stood as gatekeepers to the west, the Taklamakan and the Gobi. These were not merely sandy patches on a map, they were planetary-scale furnaces, designed by a deity with a particularly cruel sense of humor. To enter them was to willingly step into a world stripped of life, a world where the sun was your torturer, the wind was your tormentor, and the very ground beneath your feet was a trap. This was the first great filter, designed to weed out anyone with a shred of optimism left. The Taklamakan Desert, in particular, did not try to hide its intentions. Its name in the local Uyghur language is often translated as the place of no return, or more poetically, you go in and you do not come out. This wasn't a clever marketing slogan, it was a brutally honest product description. For centuries, the bleached bones of men and pack animals served as grim, informal trail markers, a silent testament to the desert's undefeated record. Entering the Taklamakan was an act of profound, perhaps foolish faith that you would be the exception to a very well-established rule. During the day, the sun was not a life-giving orb, it was a physical weight, a malevolent eye in a bleached white sky. Temperatures would soar to unbearable heights, turning the air into a shimmering, breathable fire. The light reflecting off the endless dunes was blinding, and the heat radiated upwards from the sand, cooking you from below as the sun cooked you from above. Your skin would crack, your lips would split, and the water in your skins would become unpleasantly hot. Heatstroke was a constant companion, waiting for a single moment of weakness to boil your brain in your own skull. Then came the night, and with it nature's cruelest roller coaster. Just as your body had adapted to being slow-roasted, the temperature would plummet with shocking speed, often falling below freezing. One minute you were baking, the next you were shivering uncontrollably, huddled in thin blankets, praying for the return of the sun you had just spent 12 hours cursing. This violent swing from one extreme to the other was utterly exhausting, a physical shock to the system that wore down even the hardiest traveler. Hypothermia was just as real a threat as heat stroke. As if the temperature extremes weren't enough, the desert had another weapon, the sandstorm. These were not gentle, cinematic dustings. Known as black hurricans, they were terrifying walls of sand and debris that could blot out the sun in minutes, plunging the world into a chaotic, roaring darkness. The wind howled like a banshee, and the sand scoured every inch of exposed skin. To be caught in one was to be trapped in a sensory deprivation chamber of pure terror, with the added bonus of potentially being buried alive. When the storm passed, the landscape could be utterly changed, the trail completely erased. The desert also engaged in a unique and sadistic form of psychological warfare, the mirage. After days of thirst and seeing nothing but an ocean of sand, a shimmering lake would appear on the horizon, complete with swaying palm trees. It was the most beautiful thing a man could ever see. It was also a complete lie, a cruel trick of the light. The surge of hope, followed by the crushing realization of the deception, was enough to break a man's spirit. The desert didn't just attack your body, it toyed with your mind, dangling salvation in front of you before snatching it away with a silent, sandy laugh. To the east lay the Gobi, the Taklamakan's slightly less famous but equally miserable cousin. Where the Taklamakan was an ocean of fine sand, the Gobi was a vast expanse of rock, gravel, and sparse, thorny scrub. It offered a different texture of hopelessness. Instead of sinking dunes, you had sharp rocks that would lame your camels and shred your footwear. It was just as vast, just as waterless, and just as unforgiving. The Gobi was proof that nature's capacity for creating bleak, life-hating landscapes was impressively diverse. And we mustn't forget the local residents. The deserts were home to a delightful array of creatures perfectly happy to ruin your day or end your life. Venomous snakes lay hidden in the cool shadows of rocks, scorpions enjoyed the warmth of a merchant's bedroll, and various spiders and centipedes were always eager to make an appearance. Every time a merchant reached into a bag, put on a boot, or unrolled his sleeping mat, he was playing a high-stakes game of chance with some of the planet's least friendly inhabitants. If, by some miracle, a merchant survived the horizontal hell of the desert, his reward was to enter the vertical hell of the mountains. The caravan routes were forced to navigate some of the highest and most formidable mountain ranges on Earth, including the Pamirs and the Tian Shan. These were not the rolling, friendly hills of a pastoral painting. These were jagged, angry behemoths of rock and ice, a realm of gods and monsters, where fragile humans were decidedly not welcome. The world went from flat and hot to sharp and cold. The Pamir Mountains, known ominously as the roof of the world, presented a new and inventive set of torments. After weeks of walking on flat ground, the body was suddenly forced to climb relentlessly. The scale was demoralizing, with peaks that seemed to pierce the heavens and valleys that plunged into eternal shadow. Being on the roof of the world sounds majestic, but in reality it just meant you were terrifyingly high up, and the only direction to fall was down. The most insidious enemy in the mountains was the very air you were trying to breathe. As the caravans ascended to elevations of thousands of meters, the air grew thin and starved of oxygen. Altitude sickness, or mountain sickness, was an almost universal experience. It began with a splitting headache, followed by nausea, dizziness, and a profound lethargy. Trying to lead a heavily laden, uncooperative camel along a narrow cliff edge, while your brain felt like it was swelling and your stomach was in revolt, was a unique and unenviable form of torture. The term path is a generous one for the routes these merchants followed. In reality, they were often little more than goat tracks, narrow ledges carved into the side of a cliff, barely wide enough for a single camel. To one side was a solid wall of rock, to the other, a drop of hundreds or even thousands of feet into nothingness, a gust of wind, a patch of ice, a moment of panic, or a single clumsy misstep from man or beast could send an entire fortune and several lives spiraling into the abyss. And then there was the snow. The mountains were a world of ice and frost. The caravan had to contend with sudden, violent blizzards that could appear even in the middle of summer, burying the trail and creating whiteout conditions. But the greater danger was the avalanche. The rumble of shifting snow or rock from high above was the soundtrack to many a merchant's final moment. A river of snow could sweep down a mountainside with unimaginable force, erasing an entire caravan from existence in less than a minute. Crossing glaciers was another delightful challenge. The blinding glare of the sun on the ice and snow caused a painful condition known as snow blindness, which could render a man temporarily or sometimes permanently sightless. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that seeped through layers of wool and leather and settled deep in your bones. Frostbite was a constant threat, claiming fingers, toes, and noses, leaving survivors permanently maimed as a souvenir of their time on the frozen peaks. To the north lay the Tian Shan, the Celestial Mountains. Despite the poetic name, they were no more heavenly than the Pamirs. They presented their own unique set of lethal obstacles, including notoriously unstable slopes and a complex network of passes that could easily confuse even an experienced guide. The weather here was fickle and violent, a place where a sunny morning could devolve into a raging blizzard by lunchtime. The Celestial Mountains were just another reminder that in this part of the world, even the heavens were hostile. A particularly cruel feature of mountain travel was the psychological torment of the false summit. After a grueling, lung-searing climb that felt like it would never end, a merchant would finally reach what he thought was the top of the pass, only to see another, even higher peak looming behind it. This process could repeat itself several times, each reveal of a new summit chipping away at his morale. It was a perfect metaphor for the Silk Road itself. Every time you thought you had overcome the worst, a new, more dreadful challenge revealed itself. Having survived the oven and the freezer, the merchant might find himself on the steppes of Central Asia. This was nature's third great trial, the trial of endless, soul-crushing monotony. The steppe was a vast, semi-arid grassland, a sea of grass that stretched to every horizon, unbroken by trees or hills. It was an ocean of nothing, and crossing it was a journey into a unique kind of madness. The physical danger was less acute than in the desert or mountains, but the psychological toll was immense. The sheer emptiness of the steppe was its primary weapon. For weeks on end, the view never changed. The same flat, green and brown carpet extended in every direction, under the same vast, empty sky. There were no landmarks to steer by, making navigation a nightmare and exacerbating the feeling of being utterly lost in an infinite expanse. The human mind is not built for such featurelessness, and the sensory deprivation could lead to a profound sense of dislocation and despair. It was possible to die of boredom out here. While it might seem calmer, the weather on the steppe could be just as violent as anywhere else on the journey. With no mountains or forests to break their advance, storms could form and sweep across the plains with incredible speed and ferocity. Savage thunderstorms with apocalyptic lightning, hailstorms with ice the size of rocks, and relentless howling winds could descend with almost no warning, and with nowhere to take shelter, a caravan was completely exposed to the raw, untamed power of the sky. The steppes were also not empty of people. They were the domain of nomadic horse tribes, a proud and hardy people who were masters of this environment. While many interactions were peaceful, based on trade and mutual respect, the potential for conflict was always present. A merchant caravan was a slow, rich, vulnerable target. A cultural misunderstanding, a dispute over grazing rights, or simple opportunism could lead to a swift and brutal raid. On the steppes, you were a guest in someone else's house, and the hosts made all the rules. Let's take a moment to consider the cumulative physical toll of this journey. This wasn't a relaxing walking tour. It was a multi-year campaign of abuse against the human body. A merchant's feet would be a ruined landscape of calluses, bunions, and broken toenails. His joints, especially his knees and back, would be worn down by the endless walking and climbing. His skin would be permanently weathered and leathery from the sun and wind, and his eyes would carry the perpetual squint of a man who had spent years staring into a harsh glare. The litany of suffering that nature inflicted upon these unfortunate entrepreneurs is almost impossible to overstate. It was a relentless, multi-front war against survival itself. The very planet seemed to conspire against them, throwing its worst tantrums in the form of extreme heat, cold, wind, and altitude. Their story is a testament to human endurance, but more than that, it's a cautionary tale about listening to a recruiter who promises you a glamorous job overseas. This channel runs on excavating these tales of historical agony for your sleepy time pleasure. These merchants paid the price in blood, sweat, and sanity, so the very least you can do is pay your respects with a subscription. Click that button, it's the easiest journey you'll take all day. Greetings once more, my fellow travelers in historical misery. We have navigated the soul-crushing landscapes of the ancient world, from the scorching ovens of the Taklamakan to the frozen peaks of the Pamirs. A merchant who survived nature's relentless assault could be forgiven for thinking the worst was over. Such optimism would be adorable if it weren't so fatally naive, because now our merchant had to face an enemy far more cunning, cruel, and unpredictable than any sandstorm or avalanche: his fellow man. The Silk Road was not just a trade route, it was the world's longest and most poorly secured buffet, and the merchants were the main course. The fundamental problem was the stunning lack of law enforcement. The Silk Road wasn't a state-run highway with police patrols and emergency call boxes. It was a conceptual thread passing through vast, ungoverned spaces between the spheres of influence of major empires. Once a caravan left the safety of a major city like Chang'an or Samarkand, it was essentially on its own. There was no one to call for help. The only law that existed was the law of the sword, and the only justice was the kind you could purchase in the form of hired guards, a notoriously unreliable service, as we shall see. From a bandit's perspective, a merchant caravan was the perfect target. It was, in essence, a slow-moving, heavily laden treasure chest, telegraphing its route weeks in advance. It was predictable, vulnerable, and packed with concentrated wealth. The merchants themselves, often city dwellers with more experience in abacus than archery, were seen as soft targets. The entire enterprise was a walking invitation to be robbed, a sort of mobile bank that helpfully brought its assets directly to the front door of the criminal element. The only question for the local predator was not if he should attack, but when and how. The term bandit itself is a bit simplistic, suggesting a single type of highwayman. In reality, a merchant faced a diverse and terrifying portfolio of potential attackers. The Silk Road's dangers came in many flavors, each with its own motivations and methods. One week you might be dealing with desperate nomads, the next with a disciplined military faction, and the week after with a professional criminal syndicate. Surviving one attack was no guarantee you'd be prepared for the next. It was a constant, evolving threat that required a merchant to be as much a security analyst as a businessman. First on our list are the nomadic tribes of the vast Eurasian steppe. For groups like the Xiongnu, the Scythians, and later the Mongols, raiding was not simply a criminal act, it was a fundamental part of their pastoral economy and warrior culture. They were arguably the most formidable military force on the open plains, master horsemen and archers who could strike with lightning speed and disappear back into the grasslands. They saw the slow-moving caravans of settled peoples as a legitimate source of income, a way to acquire the goods they could not produce themselves. For them, it was just business. Then there were the mountain brigands. Tucked away in the treacherous passes of the Hindu Kush or the Tian Shan were isolated communities who had turned banditry into a generational trade. They possessed an intimate, almost supernatural knowledge of their mountainous terrain. They knew every choke point, every hidden trail, every cave suitable for an ambush. They could strike from above, sending rocks tumbling down to create chaos before descending to pick through the wreckage. For these groups, caravans were a seasonal harvest, like berries or wild game. In regions experiencing political instability, which was a frequent occurrence, a merchant had to contend with desperate warlords. These were often former generals, deposed governors, or ambitious usurpers who commanded their own private armies. When imperial paychecks stopped coming, These military leaders often turned to plundering trade routes to fund their campaigns and feed their soldiers. Unlike common bandits, these warlords commanded disciplined troops, with military-grade equipment and tactics, making them an exceptionally dangerous and organized foe. Even when you thought you were safe, you were being robbed. The line between a legitimate authority and a bandit was often so thin as to be invisible. At every oasis, mountain pass, or river crossing, local chieftains or self-proclaimed officials would demand exorbitant tolls, tariffs, or protection fees. This was, of course, just extortion, with a slightly more polite vocabulary. Refusing to pay this tax would often result in your caravan being denied access to water, or more directly being attacked by the very people who were supposed to be protecting you. Beyond these groups were the truly professional criminals. In the bustling cities and caravanserai along the route, organized gangs flourished. These were not opportunistic thugs. They were sophisticated syndicates with networks of informants. Spies posing as stable hands, merchants, or beggars would gather intelligence on a caravan's cargo, departure date, and the strength of its guard. This information would be relayed ahead to an ambush party, who would be perfectly prepared. These gangs treated banditry as a craft, and they were very, very good at it. Perhaps the most paranoia-inducing threat was the one from within. A merchant's life and fortune depended on the loyalty of the men he hired to protect him, the caravan guards. These were mercenaries, often from tough martial backgrounds, but their loyalty was typically only as strong as their last payment. If a guard decided that the value of the cargo was greater than his promised salary, or if a rival offered him a better deal, a simple change of allegiance could occur. The men meant to be your shield could become your executioners in the blink of an eye. The primary tactic of any sensible bandit was the ambush. A frontal assault on a prepared caravan on open ground was risky. It was far more intelligent and effective to strike at a point of maximum vulnerability. This meant patiently waiting at a natural choke point, a narrow mountain pass where movement was restricted, a dense forest where visibility was poor, or a river crossing where the caravan was slow and disorganized. The bandits held all the cards, choosing the time and place of the attack to ensure their own maximum advantage. Before the physical assault, there was the psychological one. The attack would often begin with a terrifying cacophony designed to sow panic and chaos. Blood-curdling war cries would echo from the hills, drums would beat an intimidating rhythm, and flights of arrows would rain down from unseen positions. The goal was to shatter the caravan's cohesion and morale. Panicked animals would bolt, guards would break ranks, and the merchant would be overwhelmed by fear before the first sword was even drawn. A broken enemy is an easily defeated enemy. The raids by steppe nomads were a particularly terrifying spectacle of mobile warfare. They would not engage in static, grinding fights. Instead, swarms of horse archers would circle the caravan like sharks, staying just out of range of hand-to-hand combat. They would gallop at full speed while loosing volley after volley of arrows into the caravan's flank. They could pick off guards, lame pack animals, and methodically dismantle the caravan's defenses from a safe distance, turning an orderly procession into a chaotic scene of death and confusion. Even the supposed safety of a fortified caravanserai, the ancient equivalent of a motel, was not absolute. While their high walls offered protection from small, opportunistic bands, a large and determined force of raiders could lay siege to the compound. They could attempt to burn down the gates, scale the walls under the cover of darkness, or simply camp outside and try to starve the occupants into submission. The oasis of safety could quickly become a trap, a prison where dwindling supplies of food and water were the real enemy. The most sophisticated criminal operations relied heavily on espionage. An informant in a city could provide a wealth of information: the precise nature of the merchant's goods, was he carrying cheap pottery or priceless silk, the number and quality of his guards, his intended route, and his planned stops. With this knowledge, the bandits could perform a cold, cost-benefit analysis, deciding if the potential loot was worth the risk. For many merchants, the battle was already lost before they even packed their camels. This constant threat placed the merchant in an impossible dilemma when an attack finally came. He was faced with a grim choice, neither option particularly appealing. He could order his guards to fight back, a decision that could easily result in his own violent death and the loss of everything anyway. Or he could surrender immediately, hoping for mercy. This path also led to financial ruin, and there was no guarantee the bandits wouldn't kill him or take him captive out of sheer convenience. There was no good choice. The quality of the hired guards was a merchant's biggest gamble. These men were his insurance policy, but the policy was written in very fine, often treacherous print. While some were undoubtedly brave and loyal professionals who would fight to the death, many others were unreliable mercenaries, deserters, or criminals themselves. They might be poorly equipped, poorly trained, or simply cowards who would flee at the first sign of real danger, leaving the merchant and his goods completely defenseless. When forced to fight, a caravan would employ desperate defensive measures. The most common tactic was to form a lager, a defensive circle made from wagons, or by forcing the camels to kneel, creating a living wall. From behind this makeshift barricade, a few archers or spearmen could attempt to fend off the attackers. However, such a formation was static and easily surrounded. It was a strategy of desperation, a last stand against what was often an overwhelming and more mobile foe. Some merchants believed in safety in numbers, joining together to form massive caravans of hundreds of people and thousands of animals. In theory, this presented a more formidable target. In practice, however, such a large procession was impossible to hide. It was a giant, slow-moving advertisement of wealth that could be spotted from miles away. While it might deter smaller bands of opportunists, it also attracted the attention of major warlords or large tribal confederations, the very predators who had the numbers to overwhelm it. The best-case scenario for a merchant during an attack was, tragically, a swift and efficient robbery. In this lucky outcome, the bandits would take all the goods, perhaps some of the animals, and leave the merchant and his staff alive, albeit stripped of everything. The merchant was left stranded hundreds of miles from home with no money, no goods, and no prospects. He was financially and spiritually broken, a ghost haunting the road that had consumed his fortune. His life was spared, but his livelihood was utterly destroyed. A far grimmer fate, and a distressingly common one, was enslavement. Human captives were a valuable commodity. A merchant, his staff, and even his family could be shackled and marched off to be sold in a distant slave market. In a horrific reversal of fortune, the man of commerce became the commodity. His journey along the Silk Road wasn't over, it just had a new, terrifying itinerary that ended in a life of freedom, humiliation, and the complete loss of freedom. And of course, for many, the journey ended right there in the dust and blood of the ambush. Bandits were not known for their sentimentality, and killing was a simple tool to achieve their aims. Merchants who resisted, guards who fought back, or anyone deemed inconvenient could be slaughtered without a second thought. The site of a raid would become an impromptu graveyard, a grim tableau of slain men and animals left to be picked clean by vultures and bleached by the sun, an unceremonious and violent end to a life of incredible hardship. Ultimately, all the planning, all the capital investment, all the careful navigation of treacherous terrain could be rendered meaningless in a few terrifying minutes of violence. The merchant's entire enterprise was built on a foundation of profound and constant risk. Your investment portfolio, so to speak, was constantly at risk of being aggressively diversified by a very large, very angry man with a scimitar. It was the most brutal form of market correction imaginable, where the price of failure was often paid in blood. The human element was the most dangerous variable in the entire Silk Road equation. It was an unwinnable game of cat and mouse played over thousands of miles, where the mice were laden with treasure and the cats were armed to the teeth. These merchants gambled with their lives and frequently lost. All so we could have the luxury of these stories. Their epic failures make for our somber entertainment. The very least you can do to honor their terrible business acumen is to subscribe to this channel. Go on, click the button. It costs you nothing, unlike their journey, which very often costs them everything. Welcome back, my long-suffering listeners. Having mentally survived the horrors of the terrain and the terror of bandits, you might think our ancient merchant has earned a moment of peace. You would, of course, be wrong. We must now turn our attention to the very foundation of his enterprise, the literal engines of the caravan, the pack animals. These creatures were not merely tools, they were the merchant's business partners, his transportation, his colleagues, and quite often the bane of his existence. They were the hairy, four-legged, and frequently furious reason the entire journey was even possible. The Silk Road was not a one-size-fits-all logistical challenge. Different terrains demanded different biological solutions. On the flat, open steppes, a swift horse might be preferred. In the treacherous, narrow mountain passes, the sure-footed mule was king. But for the vast, waterless deserts that formed the bulk of the journey, there was only one animal truly, if reluctantly, up to the task: the camel. The merchant's caravan was a mismatched menagerie of these beasts, each one representing a different kind of investment and a different kind of headache. And make no mistake, these animals were a colossal investment. A strong, healthy Bactrian camel, the two-humped workhorse of the Eastern Silk Road, was an expensive and prized asset. A merchant's starting capital was tied up in these beasts as much as it was in his silks and spices. Losing an animal to sickness, injury, or theft wasn't like misplacing a tool. It was the ancient equivalent of watching a significant portion of your stock portfolio develop a limp, let out a sad groan, and then unceremoniously die, taking your future profits with it. Let us now pay respect to the undisputed star of this miserable show, the Bactrian camel. Forget the romantic notion of the noble ship of the desert. This was a more accurate picture. A grumpy, perpetually unimpressed, 7-foot-tall biological all-terrain vehicle with a terrible attitude. It was a masterpiece of evolution, perfectly designed for hostile environments and perfectly designed to make every single human it interacted with contemplate a career change. It was less a majestic ship and more a smelly, complaining, ambulatory cargo container. Of course, the camel had its advantages, which merchants were forced to appreciate. It could carry hundreds of pounds of cargo for days on end. Its famous hump stored fat, not water, allowing it to go long periods without a meal. Its wide, padded feet were perfect for hot sand, and it could drink enormous quantities of water in one sitting. It could even eat thorny, bitter plants that would kill other animals. These traits were not so much miracles as they were the absolute bare minimum requirements for not immediately perishing on the Silk Road. Now let's talk about the personality. To say that camels are stubborn is an insult to stubbornness. They possess a deep philosophical objection to doing almost anything asked of them. Your co-workers on this journey were hairy, smelled terrible, and had a nasty habit of spitting when annoyed. They groaned, moaned, and protested every single task, from being loaded in the morning to being unloaded at night. They moved with a sense of profound reluctance, as if the entire concept of work was a personal affront to their dignity. And the spitting. We must dedicate a moment to the true horror of camel spit. This was not a gentle, watery spray. It was a projectile weapon, a semi-digested glob of green, foul-smelling cud launched with surprising accuracy and velocity directly from the camel's stomach. It was a potent expression of displeasure, and being on the receiving end was a uniquely nauseating experience. The stench alone could ruin your day, and the slimy residue was a grim reminder of who was truly in charge. The journey was also accompanied by a soul-draining soundtrack of animal misery. A large camel train was never silent. It was a symphony of groans, moans, gurgles, and indignant bellows. The noise was particularly bad during the daily loading and unloading, a process the camels viewed as an outrageous violation of their personal space. For a merchant trying to maintain his sanity, the constant, low-frequency chorus of complaint was a form of slow auditory torture. The needs of the animals dictated the pace and rhythm of the entire journey. Even the hardy camel needed to eat and drink eventually. The search for adequate forage and potable water was a daily, all-consuming obsession. A merchant's route was often a desperate dot-to-dot puzzle connecting scarce water sources. Finding a pasture stripped bare by a previous caravan or a well that had run dry was a catastrophic event that could derail the entire expedition. The simple act of loading a camel was a complex and often dangerous daily ritual. First, the beast had to be persuaded to kneel, a request it often met with loud protests. Then, the cargo, weighing up to 400 pounds or more, had to be divided into 2 perfectly balanced loads and strapped to its back. An unbalanced load could chafe the animal, cause it to refuse to stand up, or even tip over mid-journey, potentially damaging the precious goods. It was a frustrating puzzle that had to be solved every single morning. And camels, for all their hardiness, were not immortal. They were susceptible to a host of unpleasant diseases. A particularly common and dreaded ailment was mange, or the scab, a parasitic infection that caused the camel's hair to fall out and its skin to crack and ooze. There were also respiratory infections, foot rot from damp conditions, and various internal parasites. With no veterinarians available, a sick camel was a ticking clock. The merchant would have to watch his valuable assets slowly weaken and die. The pace of a camel train was, to put it mildly, glacial. These animals moved at a plodding, unhurried walk of about 2 or 3 miles per hour. The journey was not a thrilling adventure. It was an exercise in extreme, mind-numbing slowness. Day after day, the scenery would crawl by with agonizing lethargy. The entire venture was dictated by the pace of its slowest, grumpiest member, ensuring that the months and years blurred into a monotonous, dusty, and incredibly long walk. While their default setting was slow, camels could be spooked into a panic. A sudden noise, the appearance of a snake, or sometimes just a mysterious camel whim could trigger a stampede. The terrified animals would scatter in all directions, shedding their carefully balanced cargo across the desert or steppe. The ensuing chaos involved rounding up the panicked beasts and painstakingly recovering the scattered merchandise, a process that could take hours or even days, assuming the goods weren't irreparably damaged. We must also address the smell. The unique, overpowering aroma of a large group of hot, tired, and perpetually unwashed camels is a sensory experience few have had the misfortune to endure. It was a thick, musky, and deeply unpleasant odor that clung to everything: the merchant's clothes, his beard, the trade goods, and the very air he breathed. After months on the trail, he probably didn't even notice it anymore, having become one with the stench of his capital assets. When a camel finally reached the end of its strength, due to age, injury, or sickness, there was no retirement pasture. The merchant, faced with a brutal economic reality, would simply unload the animal for the last time and leave it where it fell. It was a harsh but necessary business decision. The creature that had faithfully, if complainingly, carried his fortune across a continent was abandoned to the vultures and the vast emptiness of the landscape. It was a grim end for a vital member of the team. Of course, camels were not the only beasts of burden. In the treacherous mountain passes, the hybrid mule was the preferred vehicle. A cross between a male donkey and a female horse, mules inherited the sure-footedness of the donkey and the strength of the horse. They were nimble and reliable on narrow, icy ledges where a clumsy camel would plummet to its doom. However, they were sterile, meaning every mule had to be specially bred, making them a valuable and expensive commodity. Mules, like camels, came with their own legendary personality flaw, a stubbornness so profound it has become proverbial. A camel's stubbornness was loud and performative. A mule's was a quiet, unyielding, passive resistance. If a mule decided it did not want to cross a particular stream or take another step, no amount of pulling, pushing, or pleading could change its mind. It would simply plant its feet and refuse to budge, a furry, four-legged monument to defiance. Horses were the luxury sports cars of the Silk Road. They were faster, more agile, and far more prestigious than camels or mules. Important officials, messengers, and wealthy merchants often preferred them. However, they were temperamentally and physically unsuited for the harshest environments. They required more water and higher quality food than a camel, and struggled in deep sand and high altitude. A horse was a status symbol, but often a fragile and impractical one. In some flatter, more fertile regions, particularly closer to the settled lands of China, oxen were used to pull heavy wheeled carts. These powerful beasts could haul immense loads, far more than any single camel. However, they were incredibly slow and required vast quantities of fodder and water, making them completely unsuitable for long-distance desert crossings. They were the heavy freight trucks, confined to the well-watered interstate sections of the route. Amidst this menagerie of reluctant co-workers, there was one animal that might have been a genuine ally: the dog. Capybars often employed large, fierce dogs like the Central Asian shepherd. These dogs were not pack animals, but guardians. They were fearless, loyal, and had a keen sense of hearing and smell, making them an invaluable early worming system against bandits or predators. In a world of grumpy camels and stubborn mules, a loyal dog might have been the merchant's only true friend. Managing this four-legged workforce required a specialized class of human, the camel driver. These were not the merchants themselves, but hired professionals, tough and experienced men who understood the arcane art of keeping a camel alive and moving. They were another layer of expense and another layer of personnel to manage. A good camel driver was worth his weight in gold, but a bad or disloyal one could sabotage the entire journey through incompetence or malice. The entire fragile economy of the Silk Road rested, quite literally, on the strained backs of these animals. Every calculation of profit and loss was contingent on the health and performance of the caravan's beasts. A string of bad luck, a disease outbreak, a lack of forage, a mule falling from a cliff, could instantly transform a potentially profitable venture into a catastrophic loss. The merchant wasn't just trading silk, he was trading in the life force of his animal asset. Imagine the merchant's daily reality. He was the manager of a mobile logistical nightmare, a traveling circus of mismatched, smelly and ill-tempered animals. His days were spent listening to a chorus of groans and complaints, arbitrating the needs of his beasts, and praying that his most valuable assets wouldn't suddenly decide to die. It was less a grand adventure and more a terrible career in middle management, with the worst, hairiest co-workers imaginable. The merchant's journey was a testament to enduring the unendurable, and his animal companions were a primary source of that torment. Their stubbornness, their fragility, and their sheer unpleasantness made an already difficult life a living hell. They suffered so we could have this sleepy tale of woe. To honor their sacrifice and the sanity the merchants lost dealing with them, you should subscribe. It's a simple click, not a glob of warm camel spit to the face. We trust you'll find the experience far more agreeable. Welcome back, my morbid companions. We've discussed the horrors of terrain, the terror of bandits, and the sheer misery of the animals. But now we must confront the most fundamental enemy of all, an adversary more patient than a mountain and more relentless than any raider. We're talking about thirst. On the Silk Road, the lack of water was not just an inconvenience. It was the silent, ever-present threat that underpinned every other fear. It was the silent killer that dictated the rhythm of life, commerce, and, most frequently, death. The romantic image of the Silk Road is a flowing line on a map. The reality was a grim life-or-math game of connect the dots, where the dots were the few and far beyond sources of water. A merchant's route was not chosen for its speed or safety, but almost entirely for the location of oases, wells and brackish springs. The entire geography of trade, spanning thousands of miles, was shackled to the simple, desperate need for a drink. The map of the Silk Road was, in essence, a map of managed desperation. Before every leg of the journey, our merchant had to become a grim mathematician. He had to perform a brutal calculation of survival. How many men did he have? How many animals? How many days until the next known water source? One mistake in this life, or method arithmetic, a miscalculation of a day's journey, an underestimation of the heat, was a death sentence for the entire caravan. The margins for error were non-existent. The ledger he managed was not just of silks and spices, but of sips and swallows. And so, a significant portion of a camel's precious cargo space was dedicated not to profitable goods, but to the heavy, cumbersome, and entirely profitless burden of water. Stored in foul-smelling animal skins, the water was a dead weight on the balance sheet. It was a profound irony. To transport the lightest, most luxurious silks, a merchant first had to load his animals with hundreds of pounds of the most mundane and heavy substance imaginable. The water didn't make him rich, it just, with any luck, kept him from dying in a particularly unpleasant way. In the imagination of a parched traveler, the oasis was a sliver of paradise, a divine miracle of green in a world of brown and beige. It was a symbol of life, safety, and relief, the shimmering reward at the end of a long, dry trial. For weeks, under the brutal sun, the thought of that oasis, with its promise of shade and unlimited water, was the only thing that kept men and animals moving forward. It was the psychological anchor in a sea of sand, the physical manifestation of hope. The reality of the oasis, however, rarely lived up to the fantasy. It was less a pristine paradise and more a crowded, muddy and chaotic truck stop. Generations of caravans had passed through, leaving their mark. The water was often brackish and contaminated by animal and human waste. The ground was trampled and fouled. The oasis was a place of intense competition, where dozens of different groups, merchants, nomads, soldiers, all converged on a single, strained resource. It was life-saving, yes, but it was rarely pleasant. Between the major oases, a caravan's survival often depended on wells. These were often little more than holes scratched into a dry riverbed, their locations passed down through generations of travelers. Arriving at one of these wells was a moment of supreme anxiety. Had it run dry? Had it collapsed? Or worse, had a rival caravan or a hostile tribe deliberately poisoned it to deny it to their enemies? To find a well empty or fouled after days of travel was one of the most soul-crushing blows a merchant could suffer. Truly crossing a river, like the Oxus or the Tarim, was a rare and celebrated event. It was a source of seemingly unlimited water, a chance to fully replenish skins, wash away the filth of the desert, and let the animals drink their fill. But even these blessings were fraught with peril. The currents could be treacherous, capable of sweeping away men and animals. Furthermore, the water could be carrying the diseases and waste from settlements hundreds of miles upstream. A life-saving river could easily be a carrier of slow death. Water was power, and wherever it was found, there was politics. The most reliable wells and oases were often controlled by local tribes or warlords. They were, in effect, gatekeepers of life. Access to their water was never free. Merchants had to pay fees, offer gifts, or trade valuable goods simply for the right to drink and replenish their supplies. Disputes over water were common and could quickly escalate from heated arguments to bloody skirmishes. In the desert, a watering hole was a throne, and its owner was a king. The most insidious danger was the one you couldn't see. A pool of water might look clear and inviting, but it could be a teeming broth of microscopic death. With no understanding of germ theory, merchants had no way of knowing that a refreshing drink was laced with the bacteria that caused dysentery, cholera, or typhoid. These waterborne diseases were rampant along the Silk Road, turning a caravan into a mobile infirmary. Many who survived the thirst of the desert would later succumb to the invisible poisons hidden within its water. Even when the water was safe, it was rarely pleasant. Stored for weeks in goat or sheepskin bags under the hot sun, it would take on a foul, leathery taste and a lukewarm temperature. It was often brackish or salty, barely drinkable but essential for survival. There was no joy in this water, no sense of refreshment. Each swallow was a chore, a grim necessity to be choked down. The modern luxury of a cool, clean glass of water would have seemed like a divine fantasy to a Silk Road merchant. And then there was the mirage, nature's most sadistic prank, tailored specifically for the thirsty. On a blistering day when hope was dwindling, the perfect image of a lake would appear on the horizon. It was no mere shimmer. It was a detailed, convincing vision of salvation. Men would weep with joy, urging their exhausted animals forward, only to find nothing but more sand. The psychological impact of having paradise dangled before your eyes and then cruelly snatched away was devastating, often the final blow to a caravan's morale. The process of dying from thirst is not quick or merciful. It begins with a simple dry mouth and a nagging craving, but soon it becomes an all-consuming obsession. Every thought, every dream, every waking moment is dominated by the single desperate need for water. The lips crack, the tongue swells, and speech becomes difficult. The world narrows until it contains only one concept, one desire, a single cool sip of liquid. As dehydration progresses, the body begins to shut down. The headaches start, a dull throb that intensifies into a blinding agony. Dizziness and confusion set in. In a desperate attempt to conserve what little fluid it has left, the body stops sweating, causing the core temperature to skyrocket. The blood thickens to a syrupy sludge that the laboring heart struggles to pump. The body is literally drying out from the inside. The brain is one of the first organs to suffer. A dehydrated mind cannot think clearly. Judgment fails, irritability turns to rage, and vivid hallucinations begin. A merchant responsible for the lives of his men and the safety of his cargo would be rendered incapable of making rational decisions. He might wander off into the desert, convinced he saw a river, or become violently paranoid, accusing his own men of hiding water. The mind dissolves long before the body finally quits. The animals, of course, suffered the same fate. A camel, despite its reputation, has its limits. A merchant would have to watch in horror as his invaluable beasts of burden, the foundation of his entire venture, began to falter. They would weaken, their humps would deflate, and eventually they would collapse, unable to rise. Each fallen camel was a significant financial loss and a step closer to the entire caravan sharing the same fate. In a desperate attempt to prolong life, the caravan leader would enforce strict water rationing. Each person would be allotted a few pitiful sips a day, a tiny amount of liquid that did little more than momentarily wet the tongue and intensify the maddening craving. This was a time of intense suspicion. Men would eye each other jealously, watching every swallow, convinced someone else was getting an extra drop. Paranoia and mistrust would fester in the heat. The final stages are a grim descent into oblivion. The skin loses all elasticity, the eyes sink back into the skull, and the breath comes in ragged gasps. The kidneys fail, and the body is flooded with its own toxins. Delirium gives way to unconsciousness as vital organs cease to function. Finally, the heart gives out. It is a quiet, lonely, and agonizing end, a slow surrender to the silent, patient killer of the desert. When the water skins finally ran empty, the merchant faced a series of horrifying choices. Did he order the slaughter of a weakened camel to drink its blood and the fluid from its stomach? Did he abandon his priceless cargo, lightening the load for a desperate final dash towards the next oasis, which might only exist in rumor? These were not theoretical questions. They were real-time, life-or-meth decisions made by men on the very edge of existence. You could spend years of your life planning an expedition, investing your entire family fortune. You could survive blizzards in the mountains and fight off hordes of bandits on the steppes. You could manage a team of surly men and even surlier camels. But in the end, you could lose your fortune, your goods, your animals, and your life, all for the lack of a single, clean sip of water. It was the ultimate, humbling equalizer. The scarcity of water also made it a potent weapon. A cunning rival or a ruthless warlord could defeat a caravan without lifting a single sword. They could simply camp at a well and deny access to anyone else. Or, more sinisterly, they could poison a well, knowing that the next caravan to arrive would be faced with the choice of dying of thirst or dying of poison. Control the water, and you controlled the road. For those who survived a near-death experience with thirst, the memory was a permanent scar. The journey might end, but the psychological trauma would linger. Survivors were often haunted by nightmares of the desert, developing a lifelong obsessive fear of being without water. They might hoard it or panic when it wasn't immediately available. The desert had claimed a part of their soul that would never be returned. In the final analysis, the most valuable commodity on the Silk Road was not silk, nor was it gold, spices, or jade. It was water. Water was the true currency of the desert. It was the broker of life and death, the silent partner in every transaction, the master to whom every merchant, king, and bandit was ultimately enslaved. The entire glittering enterprise of the Silk Road was built upon its rare and precious drops. These ancient merchants faced down the slow, agonizing horror of death by dehydration, all in the name of commerce. Their suffering allows us to sit here, comfortably hydrated, and quench our own thirst for these tales of historical misery. The next time you take a simple, easy drink of water, perhaps spare a thought for them. Then, show your gratitude for not living in a constant state of parched terror by subscribing to this channel. Click the button. It is, I assure you, far more refreshing than drinking lukewarm, goat-flavored water from a possibly poisoned well. Welcome back, my purveyors of pessimism. We've traversed deserts, climbed mountains, dodged bandits, and endured the company of foul-tempered camels. But now we face an enemy that could not be seen, could not be fought with a sword, and could not be reasoned with. We are talking about the invisible assassins, the countless bacteria, viruses and parasites that turned the Silk Road into a mobile infirmary and the human body into a battlefield. These microscopic monsters were the most successful predators on the entire route. The caravan itself was the perfect incubator for disease, a rolling petri dish of filth and fatigue. Imagine a large group of people, already exhausted and malnourished, living in extremely close quarters with each other and their animals for years on end. Sanitation was non-existent. Personal hygiene was a forgotten luxury. They drank from the same questionable water sources and ate poorly preserved food. It wasn't just a trade caravan, it was a germs all-inclusive dream vacation. This is why, for many a merchant, the greatest source of terror wasn't a shadowy figure with a scimitar. Your biggest fear wasn't always bandits. Sometimes it was just a particularly aggressive stomach bug. A multi-year life-or-math quest for riches could be brought to a miserable, undignified end by a single contaminated sip of water or a poorly cooked piece of meat. The grand adventure often concluded not with a bang, but with a gurgle. Furthermore, the Silk Road was not just a highway for silk, it was the world's first great superhighway for pathogens. As merchants and armies moved back and forth, they acted as unwitting vectors, carrying microscopic stowaways from one continent to another. A merchant leaving China might be carrying a virus that the population of Persia had never encountered. He wasn't just a trader, he was an agent of biological globalization, connecting the germ pools of entire civilizations with often devastating consequences. Let us begin our grim diagnosis with the undisputed king of caravan ailments, dysentery. Known poetically as the flux, this gastrointestinal nightmare was a constant and unwelcome companion. Caused by bacteria and protozoa lurking in contaminated food and water, its symptoms were as unpleasant as they were debilitating. Violent diarrhea, abdominal cramps and fever would leave a man weak, dehydrated and utterly miserable. It was the background noise of sickness on the Silk Road, the common cold of gut-wrenching despair. If dysentery was the common cold, then cholera was the lightning-fast assassin. A man could wake up feeling perfectly healthy and be dead by nightfall. Transmitted through contaminated water, cholera was brutally efficient. It caused a catastrophic loss of fluids, leading to severe dehydration, muscle cramps, and shock. The speed with which it could incapacitate and kill was terrifying, capable of turning a functioning caravan into a ghost train in a matter of days. Then there was the slow, creeping misery of typhoid fever. Often contracted from contaminated food or water prepared by an infected person, typhoid didn't strike with the suddenness of cholera. It was a slow burn. The illness would build over weeks, starting with a headache and culminating in a dangerously high fever, a state of delirium, and a characteristic rash of rose-colored spots. It was a prolonged siege upon the body, a malady that slowly cooked its victim from the inside out. Beyond these specific diseases, every single meal was a game of culinary roulette. Without refrigeration, food preservation was a constant struggle. Meat would spoil, grain would grow mold, and cooking was often done in unhygienic conditions with unclean water. Simple food poisoning, with its delightful combination of vomiting and diarrhea, was an everyday risk. It was just another way the journey sought to violently expel every last drop of fluid and morale from a traveler's body. In the warmer, wetter regions of the route, particularly near stagnant water sources, another menace lurked: malaria. Transmitted by mosquitoes, this parasitic disease was a recurring nightmare. It attacked in cycles. First would come the bone-shaking, teeth-chattering chills that no blanket could warm. This would be followed by a raging, delirious fever that would leave the victim drenched in sweat and utterly exhausted. This cycle could repeat for weeks, draining a person's strength and leaving them vulnerable to other infections. The cramped and unwashed conditions of the caravan were a paradise for lice, and where there were lice, there was typhus. This nasty disease was passed through the bites of infected body lice, something every traveler had in abundance. It brought a high fever, a splitting headache, a dark rash, and severe muscle pain. Victims often became delirious and stuporous. Typhus thrived in the very conditions the Silk Road created: crowds of unwashed people huddled together for warmth. And then there was the dreaded smallpox, one of the most feared diseases of the ancient world. This highly contagious virus was a ruthless killer. An outbreak in a crowded caravanserai was a catastrophe. Its high fever and body aches were followed by the horrifying emergence of its characteristic fluid-filled pustules. For those who didn't die, and many did, it often left behind a legacy of deep, pitted scars and sometimes blindness. We often think of measles as a relatively harmless childhood disease, but in a world before vaccines and widespread immunity, it was a serious threat, especially to adults. An infection could lead to a dangerously high fever, a severe rash, and critical complications like pneumonia or encephalitis. For an adult with no prior exposure, measles wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potentially fatal illness that could sweep through a caravan with deadly efficiency. We cannot discuss diseases of the Silk Road without mentioning the most infamous of them all, the plague. While the Black Death pandemic that devastated Europe in the 14th century was its most famous outbreak, the bacterium Yersinia pestis had long been traveling these trade routes, carried by fleas hitching a ride on black rats, which in turn hitched a ride on camels and carts. The seeds of the world's most terrifying pandemic were sown along these very paths, while the merchant could be an unwitting harbinger of the apocalypse. Even the most common ailments could prove fatal. A simple cold or influenza, in a body already weakened by poor nutrition and exhaustion, could easily progress into a lethal case of pneumonia. The constant inhalation of dust from the trail and smoke from campfires irritated the lungs, leaving them vulnerable. On the Silk Road, there was no such thing as a minor illness. Every cough, every sneeze held the potential for a grim escalation. Beyond the microbial invaders, there were the parasites. A merchant could unwittingly become a host for a horrifying variety of intestinal worms, tapeworms, roundworms, hookworms, contracted from undercooked meat or unclean water. These silent passengers would live inside a person for years, secretly stealing vital nutrients and causing chronic fatigue, malnutrition, and a host of other unpleasant symptoms. You were not just eating for one anymore. The lack of hygiene also led to a constellation of skin diseases. The constant friction of rough, dirty clothing combined with sweat, dust, and grime created a perfect environment for rashes, boils, fungal infections, and infected sores. Pests like fleas and scabies mites added to the torment. Mange wasn't just a problem for the camels. Their human companions often suffered from their own itchy, painful, and persistent skin afflictions. Let us spare a thought for one particularly exquisite form of agony, the toothache. A dental abscess in the middle of the Gobi Desert was a special kind of hell. With no dentists or painkillers, the unfortunate victim could do nothing but endure the throbbing, relentless pain. The only treatment available was a crude and brutal extraction, lightly performed by the caravan's blacksmith, with a pair of pliers and no anesthetic. It's hard to say which was worse, the disease or the cure. The caravan's medical kit was less a pharmacy and more a portable museum of wishful thinking. It would contain a collection of dried herbs, powdered minerals, animal parts of questionable origin, and a variety of superstitious charms and amulets. Medical knowledge was a blend of folklore, tradition, and pure guesswork. These remedies were more likely to act as placebos than actual cures, and in some cases they were actively toxic. The role of doctor fell to whoever was deemed most experienced, which usually just meant oldest. There were no trained physicians on the trail. The caravan leader or an elderly camel driver would be the one to diagnose an illness and prescribe a cure. Their knowledge was based on what they had seen before, not on any medical science. A patient's fate rested in the hands of a well-meaning but ultimately clueless amateur. Many of the treatments were arguably more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to cure. A common practice for fevers was bloodletting, the draining of a bad humor. A patient already dangerously weakened and dehydrated from dysentery would be intentionally bled, further weakening them and pushing them closer to death. Other remedies might involve useless poultices or actively harmful herbal concoctions. Often, the best a sick person could hope for was to be left alone. The brutal pragmatism of the caravan meant that a seriously ill traveler was a liability. They slowed everyone down and consumed precious resources. If a person became too sick to ride, a terrible choice had to be made. They were often left behind at a caravanserai or, in the worst cases, simply abandoned on the side of the trail. They were left with a small amount of food and water to face an almost certain death alone. When death inevitably came, there was little time for ceremony. A shallow grave would be scraped out of the hard earth or sand, and the body would be buried quickly. There were no elaborate funerals, no prolonged periods of mourning. The caravan had a schedule to keep. A few mumbled words might be said, a pile of rocks might mark the spot, and then the procession would move on, leaving another of their number behind in the vast, silent wilderness. In the grand historical scheme, the sick merchant was more than just a victim. He was a vector. He was a biological bridge connecting the ecosystems of disease from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. His personal suffering was a footnote in the much larger story of global pandemics. The fevers and fluxes that plagued his journey were the pioneers, the scouts, for plagues that would later reshape human civilization. The final diagnosis for any Silk Road merchant was a chronic case of terminal optimism, a condition that made them believe they could outwit a microscopic army that had been perfecting its craft for millions of years. Their agonizing battles with these unseen killers have, ironically, provided us with this wonderfully bleak tale. To pay tribute to their unwilling sacrifices at the altar of pathology, you must subscribe. It is painless, entirely non-infectious, and the only known side effect is an increased appreciation for modern medicine and a steady supply of dark history. Greetings, my students of strife. We have weathered the sandstorms, survived the plagues, and outsmarted the bandits, at least in our imaginations. But now our weary merchant faces a new set of challenges, a series of obstacles that are, in their own way, just as dangerous as a cliff edge or a poisoned well. He must now attempt to do business. He must try to communicate with other human beings. In the vast, multicultural expanse of the Silk Road, this was less a simple transaction, and more a high-stakes performance of improvisational theater. Imagine the sheer linguistic chaos. The Silk Road wasn't a single nation with a common tongue. It was a sprawling network that cut across dozens of civilizations, each with its own languages, dialects, and scripts. A merchant starting in China would have to contend with various forms of Chinese, then encounter Turkic languages on the steppes, Sogdian in the great trading cities, Persian in the west, and perhaps even Greek or Latin at the very end of the line. It was a 4,000-mile-long game of broken telephone, where the penalty for failure was bankruptcy, or worse. To cope with this, certain tongues rose to prominence as lingua francas, or common trade languages. For much of the Silk Road's history, the language of the Sogdians, an Iranian people from the region of modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, served this role. They were the great middlemen of the route. But even so, this was often a second, third, or even fourth language for the people using it. Communication was reduced to its most basic, functional form, stripped of all nuance and ripe for misunderstanding. The obvious solution was to hire an interpreter, a local who could bridge the linguistic gap, but this created a new and profound vulnerability. The merchant's entire fortune now rested in the mouth of a hired hand. Was the interpreter honest? Was he competent? Was he secretly in league with the person you were trading with? A slight mistranslation, whether accidental or deliberate, could turn a profitable deal into a ruinous one. The interpreter was the most essential and potentially the most dangerous member of the entire caravan. The potential for catastrophic mistranslation was always present. A simple negotiation could quickly devolve into an international incident. Misunderstanding a number could cost you dearly. Misinterpreting a gesture could cause grave offense. Imagine trying to compliment a chieftain on his magnificent horse, only for your interpreter to accidentally imply you'd like to eat it for dinner. The line between "how much for your finest silks" and "your sister has a face like a camel's hind quarters" was perilously thin and depended entirely on the skill of your translator. Language, however, was just the first and most obvious barrier. Beyond the words themselves lay a labyrinth of differing customs, social etiquette, and deeply ingrained taboos. Every culture had its own unspoken rules of conduct. A gesture of greeting in one region, like a friendly pat on the back, could be seen as a profound insult in another. The merchant had to be more than a trader. He had to be an amateur anthropologist, constantly observing and adapting to avoid a fatal social blunder. The art of haggling, a cornerstone of trade, was a perfect example of this. The fundamental concept of bargaining was nearly universal, but its practice varied wildly. Some cultures embraced a loud, boisterous, almost theatrical style of negotiation. In other places, a more subdued, patient, and indirect approach was required. A merchant who used the wrong style could be seen as rude, aggressive, or, conversely, weak and easily cheated. He had to be a social chameleon, changing his entire demeanor at each new bazaar. Then there was the delicate dance of gift-giving. In many cultures, a business relationship could not begin without a formal exchange of gifts, but this was a minefield. What constituted an appropriate gift? Too small a gift could be seen as an insult. Too large a gift could be seen as a bribe or a sign of weakness. The merchant had to navigate the fine, blurry line between respectful generosity and demeaning bribery, all while dealing with people he could barely speak to. Even the most basic interactions were fraught with peril. What was considered polite? In some cultures, direct eye contact was a sign of honesty. In others, it was a sign of aggression. Personal space, table manners, the proper way to accept a cup of tea, all of these were potential traps. A Roman merchant with his direct and forthright manner might seem boorish to a Persian courtier, whose ornate and flowery speech might in turn strike the Roman as deceitful and effeminate. The Silk Road was also a great conduit for religion, with Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam all flowing along its paths. While this created a fascinating melting pot of ideas, it was also a minefield of potential blasphemy. An offhand comment, an improper handling of a religious text, or even a casual joke could violate a deeply held sacred belief. The penalty for blasphemy was often far more severe than for simple bad manners. The laws of hospitality were a vital part of survival, but they too were complex. To be offered food was a gesture of trust and friendship, and to refuse it could cause grave offense. But what if the food offered violated the merchant's own dietary laws? Or what if he suspected, quite reasonably, that it was prepared in less than hygienic conditions? He was faced with a terrible choice: risk insulting his host, or risk a week of agonizing dysentery. Imagine the sheer mental stress of it all. You are in a foreign city, thousands of miles from anyone who speaks your native tongue. You are trying to negotiate the price of a lifetime's investment with a man whose culture you barely understand. You are communicating through a third party who you hope isn't cheating you. Trying to haggle in 3 different languages with someone who might just rob you anyway? It was less an act of commerce and more a high-wire performance of anxiety. Compounding all these problems was the almost complete lack of a universal legal framework. What was a contract in this environment? There was no international court, no binding arbitration. A deal might be sealed with a handshake, a verbal oath, or perhaps a simple notation on a clay tablet. But all of these agreements were only as good as the honor of the parties involved, and they were utterly unenforceable once you traveled a few hundred miles away. The lack of a single stable currency was another logistical nightmare. A merchant's purse would be a chaotic jumble of Roman denarii, Persian drachms, cushion staters, and Chinese bronze coins. He had to be an expert money changer on the fly, constantly calculating fluctuating exchange rates while also being on the lookout for counterfeit or debased coins. Every transaction involved a secondary, high-stakes negotiation over the very medium of the exchange itself. This chaos extended to the most basic tools of trade, weights and measures. A pound of saffron in Antioch was not necessarily the same as a pound in Samarkand. A foot of silk in one oasis town might be shorter than a foot in the next. This lack of standardization was a golden opportunity for local traders to swindle foreign merchants, shaving off a little bit of weight or length here and there, 1,000 tiny cuts that could bleed a caravan's profits dry. If a deal went sour, if a merchant was cheated or sold faulty goods, his recourse was limited to the local justice system. This usually meant appealing to the local governor, chieftain, or warlord. Justice in these cases was often arbitrary, capricious, and heavily biased in favor of the local party. More often than not, the verdict was determined not by the facts of the case, but by the size of the gift, or bribe, offered to the presiding official. In this legal and cultural vacuum, the only currency that truly mattered was trust. A merchant's reputation was his most valuable asset. Over years and decades, relationships could be built and a network of trusted agents and partners could be established. But this trust was a fragile thing, built slowly over time and easily shattered in an instant by a single act of deceit. For a new merchant starting out, there was no one to trust. This environment was a paradise for scammers. The opportunities for fraud were endless. A common grift was to sell low-quality goods disguised as premium products. Spices could be adulterated with dust or sand. Glass could be passed off as gemstones. Silks could be poorly dyed or woven, a flaw the foreign merchant might not discover until he was 1,000 miles away, with absolutely no way to get a refund. He was buying goods on faith, and faith was a risky investment. The cumulative effect of this constant vigilance was a profound mental exhaustion. Every day was filled with uncertainty. Every human interaction, from buying fodder for the camels to negotiating a major trade, was a high-stakes encounter fraught with the potential for misunderstanding and ruin. It was a journey that didn't just tax the body, but relentlessly wore down the mind and the spirit. This constant need for suspicion and analysis bred a deep and abiding paranoia. The merchant had to question the motives of everyone he met. Was the friendly guide leading him into an ambush? Was the charming local official planning to confiscate his goods? Was the fellow merchant sharing a cup of tea with him, trying to gather intelligence? It was a lonely and deeply corrosive way to live, seeing a potential enemy in every stranger's face. And despite being surrounded by people at every caravanserai and bazaar, the merchant was often profoundly alone. He was the perpetual outsider, the alien, forever separated from those around him by a wall of incomprehensible language and mystifying customs. This deep, gnawing loneliness, stretching on for years at a time, was one of the heaviest and most unspoken burdens of the Silk Road. It is for all these reasons that very few individual merchants ever traveled the entire 4,000-mile length of the Silk Road. The journey was more often a relay race. A merchant from China would travel to a Central Asian city, sell his goods to a Sogdian middleman, who would then travel further west to sell them to a Persian, and so on. This mitigated some of the cultural and linguistic challenges, but it also meant that, at every step, a new middleman took a cut, slicing away at the potential profits. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of all was at the endpoints of the route. The wealthy Romans who draped themselves in luxurious silks often had no real idea where it came from. Pliny the Elder famously wrote that silk was a substance combed from the leaves of trees. The immense human effort, the perilous journeys, the cultural negotiations, and the profound suffering that went into producing that single piece of cloth were completely invisible to the end consumer. The ultimate bargain on the Silk Road was not for silk or spices, but the trade of a merchant's own sanity and security for the slimmest chance at profit. Their immense struggles with the simple act of human communication provide for us a wonderfully low-stress and sleepy tale. To thank these ancient, stressed-out entrepreneurs for their diplomatic nightmares, you can subscribe to this channel. The button is clearly labeled in your own language, the terms are simple, and there is absolutely no risk of being misunderstood. Welcome back, my fellow auditors of agony. Having miraculously survived the perils of nature, bandits, disease, and social awkwardness, our beleaguered merchant now faces his final and perhaps most insidious enemy. This foe doesn't wield a sword or carry a plague. Instead, it wields a ledger and an outstretched palm. We are talking about the endless, soul-crushing bureaucracy of customs, tolls, and taxes. This was not the swift death of an ambush, but a slow, agonizing financial bleed by 1,000 paper cuts. The romantic notion of the Silk Road as a seamless highway of commerce is a wonderful fiction. In reality, it was a fractured, disjointed path that cut across a chaotic patchwork of empires, kingdoms, city-states, and petty fiefdoms. And every single one of these entities from the grandest emperor to the humblest village chieftain, believed they were entitled to a piece of the merchant's cargo. The Silk Road wasn't a free trader zone, it was the world's longest and most inefficient toll road. This wasn't just about paying a tax at the grand border of an empire. The reality was far more granular and infuriating. Your profit margin was constantly being taxed by every grumpy guard with a spear at every broken-down watchtower between here and the horizon. Every city gate, every mountain pass, every river crossing was an opportunity for someone to demand payment. The journey was a relentless gauntlet of outstretched hands, each one digging deeper into the merchant's pockets. The sheer number of these stops was demoralizing. It was a system designed to wear a person down. A merchant could expect to be stopped and taxed upon entering the territory of a new kingdom. Then he would be taxed again upon entering one of its major cities. He would be taxed at the bridge to cross a river within that city. He would then be taxed upon leaving the city, and taxed again upon leaving the kingdom. It was a fractal system of extortion that repeated itself endlessly across the continent. Let's begin our tour of this menagerie of extortionists with the most legitimate authorities. At the frontiers of the great empires, like Han China or Parthia, there were organized customs houses. Here, officials, who were at least supposed to be literate, would meticulously inspect the caravan's goods. The taxes levied here were official, often enormous, and non-negotiable. At least in theory. This was the first major haircut your profits would receive, and it was performed with the cold efficiency of a state-sanctioned shearer. After the imperial shakedown, every walled city and oasis town had its own entry fee. Think of it as a mandatory cover charge for the privilege of accessing their market, a place you were forced to go to trade, resupply, and rest. The guards at the gate were the bouncers, and they were not going to let you in until you paid the toll. The fee was often arbitrary, depending on the number of your camels, the mood of the guard, and how foreign and wealthy you looked. Between the great empires, the political landscape was a chaotic mess of petty kingdoms and tribal territories, each ruled by a local potentate with an inflated sense of self-importance. Each of these minor rulers viewed the stretch of road passing through their domain as their personal property. They would establish their own customs posts, often little more than a crude hut and a spear-wielding relative, and demand tribute from any caravan that dared to pass through their insignificant corner of the world. Geographical choke points were natural magnets for this sort of enterprise. A strategic bridge was a golden opportunity to charge for crossing. A narrow mountain pass, where there was no alternate route, was the perfect place to build a small fort and demand a fee for safe passage. The keepers of these points held all the leverage. The merchants had no choice but to pay whatever was demanded, gritting their teeth as their profits dwindled with every geographical inconvenience. As we've discussed, water was power, and the owners of the oases knew it. On top of charging exorbitant rates for the water itself, they often levied an additional access fee or parking fee for the caravan. They had a captive market. A merchant dying of thirst was in no position to argue about the price. The masters of these precious green spots often became fabulously wealthy simply by monetizing the desperation of travelers. Some of the most creative extortion came in the form of protection money. A local warlord, his authority extending no further than a day's ride, would approach a caravan and demand a hefty payment. This wasn't a tax, he would explain, but a fee for his services in guaranteeing the caravan's safety from the vicious bandits who infested the area. Of course, it was an open secret that these bandits were usually the warlord's own men, who would miraculously leave you alone once their boss had been paid. Even the heavens were used as leverage. The route was dotted with shrines, temples, and holy sites sacred to the local populace. The priests or caretakers of these sites would often request a pious donation from passing caravans to ensure the favor of the local gods. This request was rarely optional. To refuse was to risk being seen as a disrespectful infidel, which could invite the wrath of not just the gods, but of the very mortal and very armed local population. The process of being taxed was itself a form of torture. It would begin with an inspection. The guards, with no regard for the delicate nature of the goods, would rummage through the merchant's cargo, They would unroll priceless silks in the dusty wind and poke their dirty fingers into bags of rare spices. This was partly to assess the value of the goods, but mostly it was an opportunity to damage things, create a mess, and perhaps, accidentally, pocket a small, valuable item. The official toll was often just a theatrical opening bid. The real transaction was the bribe. After the guard captain would announce a ludicrously high tax, he would then hint that a personal gift might persuade him to record a much lower valuation in his official ledger. This facilitation payment was the grease that kept the wheels of commerce turning. Without it, a merchant could find his caravan tied up in endless, inexplicable delays. In many of these smaller jurisdictions, the authorities had little use for unfamiliar coins. They preferred payment in kind. This meant the merchant had to pay his taxes directly from his inventory. He would watch with a stone heart as the guards carried away several bolts of his finest silk or a few precious bags of frankincense. Each payment was a direct and visible liquidation of his future profits, handed over to a man whose only contribution to the economy was owning a spear. The utter lack of standardization made budgeting for these expenses an impossible fantasy. The rules changed at every checkpoint. One town might tax a caravan based on the number of camels. The next might tax based on the estimated weight of the cargo. A third might simply have a flat foreigner fee. A fourth might determine the tax based on the phase of the moon and the disposition of the official's digestion. It was arbitrary, chaotic, and designed to maximize confusion and extraction. This process was never, ever quick. Delays were a key feature of the system. A caravan could be held at a checkpoint for hours, even days, on the flimsiest of pretexts. The official might be at lunch, or taking a nap, or simply busy. More often, the delay was a deliberate negotiation tactic. The longer a merchant waited, the more desperate he would become, and the more likely he would be to pay a larger bribe just to be allowed to move on. In the more sophisticated empires, there was even paperwork. A merchant was expected to produce permits, letters of passage, and customs receipts from previous jurisdictions. Of course, each document was another opportunity for extortion. A permit could be declared invalid, a signature could be deemed a forgery, or a document could be lost. All problems that could be magically solved with the application of a few well-placed coins. The knock-on effect of these delays was devastating. Every day spent waiting at a checkpoint was another day's worth of food and water consumed by men and animals, further eating into the caravan's supplies. It was another day of exposure to the elements and to the diseases festering in the crowded waiting areas. It was another day of risk, another opportunity for bandits to scout the caravan's strength and plan an attack. The journey was a financial death by 1,000 cuts. Each individual bribe or toll might have been survivable, but taken together, they formed a relentless cascade of expenses that could drain the profitability of even the most successful venture. A merchant could start his journey with dreams of 100% profit margin and arrive at his destination having broken even, or worse, having ended up in debt. And we cannot discount the psychological toll. The constant, grinding frustration of it all was a unique form of mental torment. It was the feeling of utter powerlessness, of being a host organism for a continent-spanning ecosystem of parasites. The journey required the patience of a saint, the negotiating skills of a master diplomat, and the resignation of a man who fully expected to be cheated at every turn. In this grim calculus, the true winners of the Silk Road were often not the merchants who risked everything, but the sedentary rulers and officials who simply sat at the choke points and grew rich. They produced nothing, invented nothing, and risked nothing. They were the gatekeepers, and they prospered by simply taxing the flow of wealth and innovation created by the blood, sweat, and tears of others. This oppressive system naturally created a powerful incentive for smuggling. Some merchants, desperate to avoid the crippling taxes of the main routes, would attempt to travel along lesser-known and far more dangerous paths. They would risk the trackless desert or the unmapped mountain pass to bypass a particularly expensive checkpoint. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy that often ended with the merchant getting hopelessly lost and dying a lonely death. When our merchant finally reached his destination and unrolled his ledger, it must have been a horrifying sight. The initial investment in goods and animals was the first line. Then came the deductions, the cost of guards, the value of goods lost in a sandstorm, the animals that had died along the way, and then there would be a long, long list of entries labeled tax, toll, fee, gift, and bribe, a testament to the 1,000 parasites he had fed along the way. The final, and perhaps heaviest toll was on the merchant's spirit. To succeed, he had to become a master of navigating not just landscapes, but a world of human greed and obstruction. Their tireless struggle against this ancient, infuriating bureaucracy has provided us with this wonderfully bleak bedtime story. To show your appreciation for their financial martyrdom, you must subscribe. It is a simple one-time transaction. There are no hidden fees, no surprise tolls, and absolutely zero risk of a corrupt official demanding a portion of your screen time. Welcome back, my tireless travelers of the dark. We have followed our merchant through deserts of despair, across mountains of misery, and past a gauntlet of ghouls, germs, and greedy gatekeepers. He has, against all odds, reached his destination. He has traded his goods. A profound sense of relief washes over him, a feeling that the worst is finally over. This fleeting moment of satisfaction is perhaps the most dangerous illusion on the entire Silk Road. For this is not the finish line, this is merely the halfway point. Now he has to go back. Having sold the goods he laboriously hauled from his homeland, our merchant now invests his earnings into a new cargo for the return trip. If he came from the west, he now possesses the coveted treasures of the east. Lustrous silks, fragrant spices, potent medicines, and perhaps even some fine porcelain. These goods are often lighter, more compact, and far more valuable per ounce than what he brought. His caravan is now a more concentrated, more tempting, and more portable prize than ever before. He has essentially upgraded from a walking warehouse to a mobile treasure chest. So you made it there? You survived the deserts, the mountains, the bandits, and the diseases? You navigated the cultural minefields and paid off every corrupt official from here to the horizon? Great! Now do it all over again, but this time with more valuable stuff for people to steal. The reward for surviving the world's most dangerous road trip was the privilege of embarking on the world's most dangerous road trip, but with a bigger target painted on your back. It's a truly terrible business model. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the return journey was the loss of ignorance. The first time, a merchant could cling to a sliver of naive optimism. He didn't truly know how soul-crushingly vast the Taklamakan Desert was. He couldn't fully comprehend the terror of a narrow mountain pass in a blizzard. Now he knows. The horrors are no longer theoretical. Every step of the way he is haunted by the precise memory of the suffering that awaits him around the next bend. The dread is no longer a fear of the unknown, but a certainty of the known. The landscape, of course, hasn't gotten any nicer in the interim. The mountains do not grant a discount for repeat customers. The deserts do not offer a loyalty program. The sun is just as merciless, the cold just as biting, and the sandstorms just as blinding as they were on the way out. Nature is a famously impartial tormentor. It doesn't care which direction you are traveling. It will try to kill you with the same dispassionate enthusiasm whether you are coming or going. And what of his trusty animal companions? The camels and mules that survived the first leg of the journey are now years older and profoundly exhausted. Their reserves of strength are depleted, making them far more susceptible to injury and disease. The merchant might have to sell his tired veterans and invest in new, unproven animals for the trip back. This means putting his new, more valuable cargo on the backs of beasts whose temperament and resilience are complete unknown. The human threats have also evolved, almost always for the worse. The local bandits and nomadic raiders are not idle. News travels along the Silk Road. They know that a foreign caravan which passed through months or years ago has likely concluded its business and will be returning. They are waiting. They know the caravan's likely routes and its potential value. Our merchant is no longer just another anonymous traveler. He is a marked man, a specific high-value target on the radar of every predator in the region. The increased value of his cargo cannot be overstated. On the way out, he might have been hauling something relatively bulky like wool or textiles. On the way back, he could be carrying Roman glassware, gold thread, or a small fortune in rare spices. This is the difference between robbing a lumber truck and robbing an armored car. The potential payoff for a successful raid is now exponentially higher, making bandits far more motivated and willing to take greater risks to attack his caravan. And the gauntlet of corrupt officials must be run all over again. Our merchant has to face the same city gate guards, the same passkeepers, and the same petty kings. But this time they know he isn't just arriving with stock, he's returning with profits. Their demands are likely to be even more exorbitant. They see him as a success story, and they are determined to claim a larger share of that success for themselves. His previous bribes just set a baseline for this new, more expensive round of extortion. Furthermore, the world is not static. A journey of this length took years, and in that time the landscape itself could have changed. A sandstorm might have completely buried a familiar trail. A landslide could have permanently blocked a mountain pass, forcing a long and dangerous detour. A crucial well might have run dry. The knowledge gained on the first trip was valuable, but it was not infallible. It could even be dangerously outdated, a map to a world that no longer existed. The seasons have also turned. The merchant's timing was a matter of life and death. If he managed to cross the Pamir Mountains in the relative safety of summer on the way out, he might find himself facing those same passes in the dead of winter on the way back. The return journey could force him to confront the worst of the seasons he managed to avoid the first time around, pitting him against lethal blizzards and impassable snowdrifts. A dark psychological trap also lay in wait. A false sense of security. Having survived the journey once, a merchant might develop a dangerous sense of complacency. He might believe he has mastered the road, that he knows all its tricks. This survivor's bias could lead him to take foolish risks, to cut corners, or to underestimate a threat he has faced before. On the Silk Road, overconfidence was just as deadly an enemy as thirst or bandits. The caravan is also not starting the return journey in peak condition. The merchant and his crew are not fresh. They are carrying the cumulative fatigue and the chronic ailments from the first half of their voyage. Their immune systems are compromised, their bodies are worn down, and their spirits are battered. They are starting this new marathon already halfway to exhaustion, making them more vulnerable to every sickness and every hardship the road throws at them. The loyalty of the hired help, particularly the interpreter, faces its ultimate test on the return journey. The temptation to betray a caravan loaded with initial stock is one thing. The temptation to betray a caravan laden with the concentrated profits of years of successful trade is another thing entirely. The final payout for a treacherous guard or a deceitful translator is now at its absolute peak, making the threat of an inside job more potent than ever. And through it all, a new psychological burden settles in: homesickness. On the way out, home was an abstract memory. On the way back, it is a tangible goal, a beacon pulling the merchant forward. Every delay, every setback, every new demand for a bribe is now doubly frustrating because it stands in the way of his final return. The journey becomes a desperate crawl towards a finish line that is tantalizingly close, yet still thousands of miles away. There is also the immense weight of expectation. The merchant is not just returning for himself, he is returning to his family who have been waiting for years. He is returning to his investors who have entrusted him with their fortunes and expect a handsome return. The pressure to protect his cargo now is immense. A failure at this stage is not just a personal financial loss, it is a betrayal of the trust of everyone he left behind. The final 1,000 miles are the crucible. The exhaustion is bone deep. The paranoia is at its zenith. The cargo is at its most valuable. The proximity to home makes the thought of a last-minute disaster unbearable. The merchant's mind would be a raging storm of what-ifs. What if the bandits strike now? What if I am cheated in the last city? What if I lose it all when I am so close? This final stretch was the most mentally grueling part of the entire ordeal. And what if he made it home, only to find the world had changed? After being gone for 3, 4, or even 5 years, the home he remembered might not exist. His investors could be dead, his family gone. The political situation might have changed. A new ruler might have seized power, or, in a final, cruel twist of market forces, the demand for the very goods he risked his life to bring back might have collapsed entirely. Even if he arrived safely with all his goods intact, a profit was never guaranteed. Now came the grim accounting. He had to pay back his initial investors, often with substantial interest. He had to tally the cost of every lost animal, every bribe, every toll, every bit of damaged merchandise. When the final numbers were run, the dream of fabulous wealth often evaporated into a meager profit, or worse, a mountain of debt. The multi-year journey from hell had been for nothing. The man who returned was a phantom of the man who had left. He was physically and psychologically scarred. His skin was leathered by the sun, his body was racked with chronic ailments, and his eyes held the haunted, distant look of a man who had seen too much. He was a living testament to the true cost of the journey, a walking archive of its horrors. The moment of arrival, then, was a complex cocktail of emotions. There was the profound, overwhelming relief of simply being alive and being home. But this was immediately tempered by the cold, hard reality of the ledger. Was it all worth it? Was the silk and spice worth the friends lost, the years stolen, the health ruined? For many, staring at their meager returns, the honest answer must have been a bitter and resounding no. And what was the reward for the few who actually succeeded, who navigated every peril and returned with a handsome profit? The ultimate dark irony is that they, or their sons, were often the first to be tapped by investors to fund another expedition. The price for surviving hell was a first-class ticket to go straight back. It was a cycle of suffering, fueled by the slim possibility of success. The return journey was the punchline to a very long, very cruel joke. It was a perfect mirror of the initial ordeal, but reflected back with higher stakes and the added torment of experience. The Sisyphean struggle of these ancient merchants, forever pushing their boulder of cargo up a mountain of risk, provides the perfectly bleak and repetitive story to help you drift off to sleep. To ensure we can continue to retrace these cycles of despair, you must subscribe. It's a one-way transaction, no return journey is required, and the only toll is a single, painless click of a button. Do it now. Welcome back, my purveyors of peril. We have journeyed through a landscape of physical, biological, and cultural horrors. We have seen how a merchant's life was constantly at risk. But now we must turn to the very reason he subjected himself to this nightmare: the money. One might assume the potential for riches was so great it made all the suffering worthwhile. That assumption, like so much about the Silk Road, is a dangerous and often fatal fiction. The financial risks were just as terrifying as the bandits and the sandstorms. Before a merchant ever smelled a camel or saw a desert, he was already in a deep financial hole. Few had the personal wealth to fund such a massive undertaking themselves. They relied on capital from other sources: their extended family's entire savings, a syndicate of wealthy investors, or lenders who charged exorbitant interest rates. The merchant wasn't just gambling with his own life, he was gambling with the fortunes of everyone he knew. The pressure was immense before he even took his first step. The initial overhead was astronomical. First, there was the cost of the goods themselves, a significant outlay of capital for a product he wouldn't sell for years. Then came the purchase of a small army of camels, each one a major investment. He had to hire and provision guards, guides, and interpreters, and finally he had to pay the first wave of bribes and exit tolls just to get his caravan out of his home city's gates. He was hemorrhaging money long before he had any hope of earning it back. This wasn't just a career, it was a high-stakes bet, where the collateral was everything you and your family owned. The entire future of your lineage, your name, your very place in society rested on the outcome of this single, multi-year venture. It all hinged on whether those spices didn't get wet, or stolen, or simply become unpopular 3 years from now. It was a level of financial anxiety that is difficult for us to even comprehend in our modern world of contracts and insurance. And that is a crucial point. There was no safety net. There was no ancient equivalent of an insurance policy for lost cargo. There was no way to hedge against disaster. There was no bankruptcy protection to shield your family from your failures. The risk was total, brutal, and absolute. If the caravan was lost, to bandits, to a blizzard, to a plague, the investment was not just gone, It was a black hole that sucked the fortunes of the merchant's entire family and his investors down with it. The most obvious and straightforward financial risk was, of course, theft. As we've detailed in horrifying fashion, bandits were an ever-present threat. To lose your cargo to a raid wasn't just a minor setback. It was the complete and instantaneous annihilation of your entire capital investment. One bad afternoon in a mountain pass could undo years of planning and plunge your family into a state of permanent ruin. The bandits didn't just steal your goods, they stole your future. But you didn't need a bandit to lose everything. Nature itself was a relentless destroyer of value. Many of the goods traded on the Silk Road were delicate. A sudden river crossing or a leaky water skin could ruin priceless bolts of silk. Spices and medicines could get damp, rendering them moldy and worthless. A single clumsy camel, stumbling on a rocky path, could send a crate of valuable ceramics or Roman glassware crashing to the ground, instantly transforming a fortune into a pile of glittering shards. Your capital assets were also, unfortunately, alive and prone to dying. A significant portion of the initial investment was tied up in the caravan's animals. A dead camel was not just a logistical problem, it was the ancient equivalent of watching your delivery truck catch fire and explode. An outbreak of disease among the pack animals could cripple the entire enterprise, leaving the merchant stranded with a fortune in goods and no way to move them. And let us not forget the death by 1,000 cuts we explored earlier. Every toll, every customs duty, every gift to a grumpy guard was a direct hit to the bottom line. These were not minor inconveniences. They were a systematic siphoning of the venture's potential profit. A merchant could successfully transport his goods thousands of miles, only to find that his entire profit margin had been consumed by the endless parade of outstretched palms he encountered along the way. But perhaps the most insidious risk was the fickle nature of the market itself. A merchant would begin his journey carrying goods that were in high demand and fetched a premium price. He would spend the next 3 years of his life hauling them across a continent. Upon arrival, he might find that tastes had changed. A new fashion might have made his textiles obsolete. A rival may have discovered a new, cheaper source for the same spices. His precious cargo, for which he risked everything, was now tragically unpopular. The risk of competition was a constant shadow. Our merchant was not the only one with the bright idea to trade along these routes. Imagine surviving for years, finally approaching your destination, only to discover that another, larger caravan, carrying the exact same goods, had arrived a week before you. They would have flooded the local market, causing the prices to crash. Your timing, something almost entirely out of your control, could be the sole factor between immense profit and devastating loss. The political landscape was as treacherous as any mountain pass. A merchant might set out for a city that was part of a stable and friendly kingdom. He arrives 3 years later to find that the city has been conquered, a new warlord sits on the throne, and the old trade agreements are meaningless. The gates might be closed to him. The new regime might confiscate his goods as spoils of war. The entire political context of his journey could shift while he was incommunicado in the middle of a desert. Wars and conflicts between the various kingdoms along the route could shut down huge swathes of the Silk Road for years at a time. A war between Persia and Rome, for example, could sever the main artery of trade between East and West. A merchant could find himself trapped on the wrong side of a blockade, unable to move forward or backward, stranded in a foreign land with a caravan full of goods that he could neither sell nor transport. The very money he used was a source of risk. In an age of non-standardized currency, a merchant had to be a shrewd judge of value. A king, short on cash, might decide to debase his kingdom's coinage, mixing the gold or silver with cheaper metals. A merchant who accepted these debased coins as payment would find, to his horror, that the money he received was worth significantly less than he thought. He could be paid in full and still be cheated. Many long-distance merchants relied on agents or partners stationed in distant cities. This was a relationship built on a foundation of fragile trust. The agent could die while the merchant was en route. He could be dishonest and abscond with the profits. His own business could fail, leaving him bankrupt. The merchant could arrive after years of travel to find that his trusted contact and the entire basis for his commercial plan had simply vanished. And every single delay, no matter how small, had financial consequences. A 2-day hold-up at a border crossing was 2 extra days of wages for the guards. It was 2 extra days of food and fodder for the men and animals, a direct depletion of the caravan's supplies. It was 2 extra days of risk, of exposure to weather and disease. And it was 2 days closer to potentially missing a crucial market window at his final destination. Time, for the merchant, was quite literally money. Imagine the unique horror of completing the journey. You have survived every conceivable peril. You have brought your caravan and your cargo thousands of miles across the known world, and then, after the final, grim accounting, you realize that the venture has lost money. The expenses, the losses, the bribes, and the devalued goods have overwhelmed the profits. You are now faced with the prospect of returning home, not as a triumphant success, but as an abject failure. The consequences of such a failure were catastrophic. In a world without bankruptcy laws, a merchant who could not repay his investors and lenders faced a grim fate. He could be thrown into a debtor's prison, a squalid hellhole from which he might never emerge. In many societies, he and his entire family could be forced into a state of indentured servitude, effectively becoming slaves to the people whose money he had lost. Even if he avoided prison or servitude, the social ruin was absolute. In a merchant society, commercial success was intrinsically linked to honor and social standing. A failed merchant was a pariah. He brought shame upon his name and his family. He would be ostracized, his reputation destroyed. He was a walking symbol of failure and bad judgment, a man whose word and whose handshake were now worthless. It is crucial to remember that the stories we have of fabulously wealthy Silk Road merchants are, by their very nature, examples of extreme survivor bias. They are the lottery winners. For every Marco Polo who returned with tales of incredible riches, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of forgotten merchants who vanished without a trace, who were slain by bandits, who succumbed to disease, or who simply returned home broken and penniless. Failure was the norm, success was the miracle. In this brutal economic ecosystem, the people who took the least risk often made the most money. The sedentary investors, the wealthy bankers, and the established middlemen in the great trading cities were the ones who truly prospered. They could finance multiple caravans, diversifying their risk. If one caravan failed, another might succeed. But for the traveling merchant, it was an all-or-nothing proposition. He was the one who gambled everything on a single perilous throw of the dice. What kind of person would willingly sign up for this? It required a psychological makeup that is hard for us to fathom. It was a potent cocktail of desperate ambition, boundless optimism, a high tolerance for suffering, and perhaps a complete detachment from the mathematical realities of risk. It was the entrepreneurial spirit in its most raw and unforgiving form, where the price of failure was not just financial, but often final. And yet, this relentless, brutal, and often ruinous risk-taking was the engine that powered the first global economy. The world was connected on the backs of these countless financial failures. The luxuries that graced the courts of Rome and China were paid for not just in gold, but in the bankruptcies and broken lives of thousands of forgotten merchants. Their personal calamities were the invisible foundation of a new, interconnected world. Listening to this story of financial ruin is, for you, a completely risk-free endeavor. The merchant's finances were a house of cards in a hurricane. Your investment in this channel, however, is perfectly safe. To receive a guaranteed high return on our unique brand of dark history, we strongly encourage you to subscribe. There is no capital outlay required, no risk of your interest suddenly becoming unpopular, and the only market fluctuation is our ever-increasing library of historical misery. Click that button. It is the safest and most profitable bet you will make all night. Welcome, my fellow observers of anguish, to our final chapter. We have chronicled the endless external threats that plagued the Silk Road merchant, the brutal landscapes, the predatory bandits, the insidious diseases, and the ceaseless financial anxieties. But now we must turn our focus inward, to the last and most intimate battlefield, the merchant's own mind. For the journey did not just leave scars on the body, It waged a relentless war on the sanity of any who dared to travel it. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer cacophony of anxieties playing on a loop in our merchant's head. The fear of financial ruin, the terror of a sudden raid, the creeping dread of a fever, the gnawing worry of a dwindling water supply, the frustration of a stubborn camel, the stress of negotiating with a hostile stranger. This wasn't a series of isolated problems. It was a constant, overlapping symphony of stress, a multi-year performance with no intermission. In such an environment, even the most basic human need becomes a luxury. Sleep, for the merchant, was less about rest and more about, can I finally stop worrying about getting robbed for 5 minutes? It wasn't a state of peace. It was a temporary, often unsuccessful ceasefire with his own anxieties. He would lie down, fully clothed, a weapon by his side, one ear always open for the sound of a snapped twig or a suspicious whisper. True rest was a forgotten country. Modern science understands the corrosive effect of chronic stress on the human mind. The constant drip of adrenaline and cortisol rewires the brain, leading to anxiety disorders, depression, and paranoia. Our ancient merchant didn't have this vocabulary, of course. He only knew it as a slow, creeping weariness, a hollowing out of his spirit, a gradual descent into a state where fear and suspicion were his most constant and intimate companions. A profound sense of isolation was the bedrock of this psychological torment. For years on end, the merchant was the perpetual outsider, the foreigner. He was never truly among his own people, never able to fully relax or speak his native tongue without a filter. He was a man adrift in a sea of alien cultures, a walking island of loneliness. This deep, protracted isolation was a heavy weight, pressing down on his soul with every step. To survive, the merchant had to cultivate a state of professional paranoia. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. It was a liability that could get him killed. Every friendly stranger who approached him at a bazaar was a potential thief sizing him up. Every official who offered a helping hand was a potential extortionist looking for an angle. Every potential business partner was a potential cheat. He had to assume the worst in everyone he met simply as a baseline survival strategy. This necessary paranoia would have been visible in his very posture, a man forever scanning the horizon for movement, a man whose eyes darted around assessing every face in a crowd, a man who could never fully settle, never turn his back on an open space. He could never accept a kind gesture at face value. It had to be analyzed, dissected, and inspected for hidden motives. His mind was a fortress, and the drawbridge was permanently up. The deepest paranoia, however, was reserved for his own camp. The very men he hired to protect him, his caravan guards, were a source of constant anxiety. Their loyalty was a commodity easily bought and sold. He had to sleep among men who knew the full value of his cargo, men who might at any moment decide that murdering him and taking everything was a better career move than accepting their meager salary. He was an employer who had to constantly watch his employees, a leader who could never trust his followers. In a commercial world devoid of enforceable contracts, every transaction was a terrifying leap of faith. The merchant had to read people, to gauge their honor and intentions based on a handshake and a gut feeling. The sheer mental energy expended on this constant, high-stakes character assessment was immense. Every deal was a source of profound anxiety, both before it was made and long after, as he waited to see if the goods were genuine or the payment was sound. The long-term effects of this mindset would be devastating. A man who spends years living in a state of constant, justified paranoia does not simply switch it off when he gets home. He would return to his family and his community a changed man, suspicious, guarded, and unable to trust even those closest to him. The Silk Road had a way of following its travelers home, haunting their peace and poisoning their relationships. The war was over, but the soldier in him could never stand down. We must also remember that the merchant was not merely a passenger on this voyage of despair, he was its captain. He was the leader, the person responsible for every life and every coin invested in the caravan. This burden of command was a crushing weight. Every decision, from which route to take to how to distribute the day's rations, rested on his shoulders. A wrong choice could lead directly to death and ruin. And the choices he faced were often impossible. Do we risk crossing the river in a flood? Or do we wait and deplete our supplies? Do we fight the bandits and risk annihilation? Or do we surrender and face certain bankruptcy? Do we abandon a man sick with plague to save the rest of the caravan? These were not abstract ethical dilemmas. They were real-time decisions with life-or-death consequences. The moral cost of such choices would weigh on a man's conscience forever. Through it all, the merchant had to project an unshakable aura of confidence. He was an actor, playing the part of the decisive leader for the benefit of his men. Any sign of fear, doubt, or indecision on his part could trigger a panic, a loss of morale, or even a mutiny. He had to be a stoic rock, even when internally he was crumbling with terror and uncertainty. The mask of command was a heavy one to wear, day after day, for years. When things inevitably went wrong, as they always did, the guilt was his and his alone. The death of a guard in a skirmish, the loss of a camel to disease, a disastrously bad trade, all of it was his responsibility. He had to carry the weight of every failure, every loss. He was the lightning rod for all the caravan's misfortune, absorbing the blame and the second-guessing of his men, and the even harsher judgment of his own internal critic. The journey was also a bizarre oscillation between sensory extremes. One week he would be in a bustling, chaotic city, a riot of noise, smells, and colors. The next he would be in the profound, featureless silence of the Gobi Desert, where the only sound was the wind and the plodding of his own camels. This jarring switch between sensory overload and sensory deprivation was deeply disorienting, further unsettling an already fragile mind. And then there was the boredom. The sheer, soul-crushing monotony of the journey is a form of suffering we often overlook. Day after day, week after week, month after month of seeing nothing but the same barren landscape. The mind, starved of stimulus, can begin to turn on itself. It was a long, slow grind that could erode a man's sanity just as surely as a sandstorm could erode a rock. The mind and body are inextricably linked. The chronic physical suffering, the aches, the pains, the constant hunger, the debilitating sicknesses had a direct and devastating impact on the merchant's mental state. It is difficult to maintain a positive outlook when your teeth are aching, your gut is churning, and your skin is covered in sores. The physical misery was a constant grinding drag on his psychological resilience. While the term did not exist, it is almost certain that many of these merchants suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They would have been haunted by flashbacks of violent attacks, plagued by nightmares of freezing to death in a mountain pass, and afflicted with a constant state of hypervigilance. They were men who had witnessed and endured horrors that their minds were simply not equipped to process. A man who spent so many years on the road could also experience a profound loss of self. His old identity as a son, a husband, a member of a community would begin to feel like a distant dream. The road would remake him into something new, something harder. He was a creature of the caravan now, and upon returning home he might find that he no longer fit, that he no longer knew how to be the person he once was. Survival on the Silk Road often required a brutal pragmatism. A merchant had to become hardened to suffering and death. He had to be capable of making ruthless decisions, of leaving a sick man behind, of accepting violence as a routine part of his life. This process of brutalization, while necessary for survival, would inevitably chip away at his humanity, leaving him a colder, more callous, and more damaged version of his former self. And what of the rare merchant who succeeded, the one who returned with a fortune? He might find that the wealth felt strangely empty. What good were silks and spices when his nights were filled with terror and his days were filled with suspicion? He had traded his peace of mind for a pile of coins, and he might come to realize too late that he had made a very bad bargain. The man who returned was often too broken to enjoy the prize he had won. In the final tally, the true cost of the Silk Road was not measured in gold or silver, but in fragments of sanity. The journey demanded a tax, not just on a merchant's cargo, but on his very soul. The men who walked these paths were slowly ground down by a millstone of fear, loneliness, and exhaustion. Their internal suffering, their quiet descent into despair, is the last and perhaps the darkest chapter in this story. The quiet, internal suffering of these individuals is the forgotten narrative of the Silk Road, the invisible ink in every grand historical account of trade and cultural exchange. And now, as you lie in your safe, comfortable bed, let the story of the merchant's shattered mind be a gentle, oddly comforting lullaby. He found no peace on his journey, but hopefully you can find yours. To ensure more of these tales of historical torment can soothe you to sleep, you must subscribe. It's a stress-free decision that requires no trust and carries a 0% chance of inducing a multi-year anxiety disorder. Click the button and rest easy. Welcome back, my connoisseurs of calamity. We have dissected the journey, the dangers, and the deteriorating psyche of our Silk Road merchant. But now, let us turn our attention to the very reason for this multi-year exercise in misery, the cargo itself. A merchant didn't risk life and limb to transport durable goods like iron or timber. No, he dealt in the most luxurious, the most desirable, and often the most ridiculously fragile products imaginable. The goods themselves were a primary source of unending anxiety. The fundamental logic of the Silk Road demanded goods with an extremely high value-to-weight ratio. To make the perilous and expensive journey even remotely profitable, the items carried had to be worth a fortune for their size. This meant that every caravan was, pound for pound, one of the most valuable collections of assets on the planet. It was a slow-moving treasure vault, a fact that was not lost on the multitude of thieves, bandits, and corrupt officials who lay in wait along the route. It's one thing to worry about your own safety, but imagine the unique and constant stress of knowing that your entire family's fortune, the sum of all your hopes and dreams, is physically embodied in your cargo. Your entire future was basically a stack of very delicate, very tempting fabric or a crate of easily shattered pots. The well-being of your goods was inseparable from your own, and they were in many ways far more fragile than you were. This inherent fragility meant that the art of packing was a critical survival skill. This was not simply a matter of tossing things into a crate. Each item had to be meticulously protected from the litany of threats the journey presented. Goods had to be shielded from moisture, from the gnawing of pests, from the friction of 1,000 miles of jostling, and from the clumsy handling of guards and toll collectors. A single poorly packed container could easily mean the difference between returning a hero and returning a beggar. Let us begin with the headliner, the star of the show, the product that gave the road its very name, silk. This legendary textile, its production a jealously guarded secret by the Chinese for centuries, was the ultimate luxury good. It was incredibly lightweight, astonishingly strong for its sheerness, and more valuable than gold in the markets of the West. To carry silk was to carry solidified desire, a cargo that was guaranteed to fetch an astronomical price if it survived the journey. But silk, for all its wonders, was profoundly vulnerable. Its mortal enemy was water. A leaky water skin, a sudden downpour during repacking, or a river crossing gone wrong could leave the fabric with permanent spots and discoloration, ruining its value. It was also a delicious meal for moths and other insects that could infest a caravan's supplies. Even the constant, gentle friction of the journey could cause the delicate threads to fray, while the relentless sun could fade its brilliant, expansive dyes. Protecting this precious fabric was a full-time obsession. Bolts of silk would be carefully wrapped in layers of protective material, perhaps heavy wool or even oiled leather, to shield them from the elements. Dried herbs, known for their insect-repellent properties, like lavender or camphor, might be packed between the layers. But no matter how well it was packed, the merchant would lie awake at night, tormented by the thought of a single drop of moisture or a single hungry moth larva making its way into his primary acid. Of course, silk was not the only textile on the road. Fine woolen goods from Persia and Central Asia, prized for their warmth and intricate weaves, were also highly sought after. Cotton textiles from India, known for their softness and breathability, were another key commodity. While generally hardier than silk, these fabrics were even more susceptible to mold and rot if they got damp, and they were just as appealing to the legions of pests that called a camel caravan home. Perhaps the most anxiety-inducing cargo of all was ceramics. Chinese porcelain, with its thin, translucent, and unbelievably delicate construction, was a marvel of craftsmanship highly coveted in the West. But the very idea of transporting it thousands of miles on the lurching, swaying back of a camel is a testament to either brave ambition or sheer madness. The merchant was essentially running a mobile earthquake simulation test on his most fragile and expensive goods for 2 years straight. Imagine the unique, heart-stopping terror of hearing a sudden, sharp crack from a cargo pack, followed by the faint, tinkling sound of shattering. The merchant wouldn't even need to open the crate to know what had happened. In that single sickening sound, a significant portion of his net worth had just been transformed into a worthless pile of beautifully decorated dust. Every stumble of a camel, every jolt of the path, was a potential financial catastrophe. The Romans, in turn, produced their own highly desirable and fragile commodity, glassware. Intricate Roman glass bowls, cups, and bottles were a novelty in the East and fetched a high price. So caravans traveling from west to east were burdened with the same nightmare. They were shipping delicate, brittle glassware across the same deserts and mountains. It was a symmetrical exchange of logistical anxiety, a shared, continent-spanning nightmare of protecting delicate things. The irony of carrying these goods was that protecting them required immense amounts of dunnage or padding. To keep the porcelain and glass from shattering, it had to be packed in huge quantities of straw, cloth scraps, or other soft materials. This padding added significant bulk and weight to the caravan, taking up valuable space that could have been used for more profitable goods. The cost of not breaking things was a significant reduction in how many things you could carry. Other delicate luxury items presented their own challenges. Exquisite Chinese lacquerware with its smooth, glossy finish could be easily scratched, chipped, or cracked by a single careless moment. Intricate carvings in jade, ivory, or rhinoceros horn were similarly vulnerable. These were not rugged commodities, they were works of art, and they demanded the constant, gentle care that was almost impossible to provide on the brutal, chaotic environment of the trail. Let us move now to the aromatic anxieties of spices. For the Roman world, spices from the East, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, were worth more than their weight in gold. They were the scent of wealth, the taste of luxury. Unlike porcelain, they didn't shatter, but they had their own mortal enemy, a foe that was everywhere on the journey: moisture. A merchant carrying spices lived in constant fear of dampness. A single rainstorm caught during a repacking stop, or a canteen that wasn't properly sealed, could be a financial disaster. A bag of priceless dried clothes that got wet would quickly turn into a foul, moldy, worthless brick. The merchant's obsession with keeping his cargo dry was absolute. He was not just a trader, he was a master of waterproofing, a guardian against the relentless threat of mildew and rot. Spices were also a prime target for fraud. They were easy to adulterate. A dishonest supplier could bulk up a bag of expensive black pepper with ground-up berries or even simple dust. Saffron, the most expensive spice of all, could be mixed with the far cheaper petals of the safflower. The itinerant merchant was at a distinct disadvantage. He might not have the expertise to spot the fraud, or he might not discover he'd been cheated until he was 1,000 miles away, with no recourse whatsoever. The trade in perfumes and incense carried similar risks. Precious resins like frankincense and myrrh, essential for religious ceremonies and personal fragrance, had to be protected from heat that could melt them and moisture that could ruin their aroma. The strong, pervasive scent of these goods, while desirable at their destination, could also be a liability on the road, a fragrant advertisement to any potential thief that this caravan was carrying something exceptionally valuable. The Silk Road was also a conduit for medicines. Rhubarb from China was a prized laxative in the West, while ginseng was valued as a powerful tonic. The trade in these and other medicinal herbs was lucrative, but their efficacy depended entirely on their proper preservation. Their potency could be destroyed by exposure to heat, light, or dampness. A life-saving herb, through poor handling, could become nothing more than a bag of useless, flavorless dirt. At the other end of the fragility spectrum were precious metals. Gold and silver were often traded as bullion or in the form of coins and exquisite objects. These goods had the advantage of not shattering or spoiling. However, they were incredibly heavy, requiring strong animals and reducing the caravan's speed. And their value was, of course, universally understood. making them the #1 top-tier prize for any self-respecting bandit. Carrying a large amount of gold or silver was a unique security nightmare. It could not be disguised. Its weight was a dead giveaway. The paranoia of guarding it would have been immense. The merchant would trust no one. Every guard he hired to protect the gold was also the person with the greatest opportunity to steal it. Every night would be a sleepless vigil, watching over the dead weight that represented his fortune. Gemstones were in many ways the perfect trade good. Jade, pearls, rubies, and sapphires were small, lightweight, and fantastically valuable, but this very quality made them incredibly easy to steal. A single guard or a dishonest servant could palm a small pouch containing a fortune and disappear into the night. A lifetime of work could vanish in a single, deft, and silent act of theft. Furthermore, trading in gems required a level of expertise that few possessed. A merchant had to be a skilled gemologist to distinguish a true ruby from a worthless garnet, or to assess the quality and value of a piece of jade. The potential for being fooled by a clever fake or a low-quality stone was enormous. A single bad purchase, based on a moment of poor judgment, could wipe out the profits from an entire expedition. So, let us tally the job description. A merchant had to be a logistics expert, a veterinarian, a security chief, a diplomat, and a linguist. On top of all that, he had to be a museum curator for a fragile collection of treasures, a master packer, and an expert in the preservation of delicate organic materials. The sheer crushing weight of responsibility for the goods themselves was a full-time job, layered on top of all the other horrors of the road. The final product that a Roman noble held in his hand, a smooth bolt of silk, a delicate glass bowl, was a miracle. Its high price reflected not just the cost of production, but the immense pyramid of risk, anxiety, and specialized knowledge required to shepherd it across the known world. The merchant's constant, nagging anxiety over a chipped vase or a damp spice bag is the quiet, miserable backdrop to our story. Their material handling misery is, for us, a source of gentle slumber. To continue benefiting from their suffering, you must subscribe. It's a high-value click with zero risk of breakage. We guarantee our content will arrive in pristine condition directly to your screen. And so, we come to the end of our long and miserable journey. We have followed our merchant across sun-scorched deserts and frozen mountains. We have watched him fend off bandits, diseases, and his own profoundly ill-tempered camels. We've seen him haggle in forgotten tongues, pay endless bribes to greedy officials, and risk his fortune on the integrity of a single, fragile bolt of silk. We have painted a picture not of a romantic adventurer, but of a man trapped in a multi-year nightmare of his own ambitious design. The Silk Road was less a golden path to riches and more a dusty trail of tears. Let us briefly tally the final cost. The physical toll was immense. This was a life that aged a man decades in a matter of years. It was a life of chronic pain, of joints ground down by endless walking, of skin turned to leather by the relentless sun and wind. It was a body racked by strange fevers, infested with parasites and fueled by a diet that would make a goat shudder. The merchant who returned was a physical wreck, a walking museum of the hardships he had endured. The financial cost was, for most, a catastrophe. The dream of returning with a fortune was a powerful lure, but the reality was often ruin. After years of hemorrhaging money on bribes, tolls, lost animals, and spoiled goods, the final profit margin was often razor-thin, if it existed at all. For every merchant who returned a success story, hundreds more returned to face debtor's prison, indentured servitude, and the profound social shame of having gambled their family's future and lost. And what of the mind? The psychological cost was perhaps the heaviest of all. The years of isolation, the constant paranoia, the burden of leadership, and the relentless, grinding stress wore away at the soul. The merchant was forced to become hard, suspicious, and ruthless to survive. He returned a stranger to his own family, haunted by the things he had seen and the choices he had made. The journey would end, but the mental scars would last a lifetime. So who was this forgotten man? He was not the hero of the story. The heroes were the kings and emperors who grew rich from his suffering. He was the unsung laborer, the forgotten cog in the first great machine of global commerce. He was the man who paid the price for progress in his own blood, sweat, and sanity. His profound and varied misery was the invisible foundational ingredient in every luxury good that crossed the continent. He was the human cost of a silken dress in Rome. And so, as you lie there in your comfortable bed, perhaps listening to this on a device that was delivered to your door by a uniformed stranger in a climate-controlled vehicle, take a moment to appreciate the difference. Your goods travel on paved highways with GPS navigation. Your payments are secured by international banking laws. Your biggest delivery risk is a package left out in the rain. Be grateful for online shopping, for modern medicine, and for the merciful absence of spear-wielding bandits outside your door. Because when you strip away the romance and the legend, the life of a Silk Road merchant was an exercise in profound, multifaceted, and almost unendurable suffering. It was a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, but it was also a testament to humanity's stunning capacity for enduring misery in the pursuit of profit. It was a life of grueling hardship, perpetual danger, and immense financial risk, punctuated only by brief, fleeting moments of relief. Life on the Silk Road? That truly, spectacularly sucked. Their spectacular failure and occasional miserable success is our sleepy time story. Their suffering has been our content. To ensure their misery was not entirely in vain, you have a solemn duty to subscribe to this channel, so that more tales of historical woe can be unearthed for your restful pleasure. It is the final, most important transaction of our journey together. So as you drift off to sleep, remember the silent struggles of those who trekked across continents, risking everything for a piece of silk or a pinch of pepper. May their story, full of strife and anxiety, paradoxically bring you peace. Thanks for listening tonight, and may your dreams be calm and your history lessons profoundly, wonderfully bleak.